Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Deku Fought an Evil All Might Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
It all began with the birth of a glowing child in China. Soon after, people all over the world began to exhibit enigmatic abilities known as quirks. It was total and utter mayhem. Nothing was settled until a man arrived who had a unique quirk that enabled him to take quirks and pass them on to others. Because he drained their unwanted powers, his company protected mutants and people with frightening and dangerous quirks from both themselves and those who would despise them. It also made power available to those who desired it and could use it for good. He eliminated the quirk phenomenon's element of randomness. It was less frightening because of him. He reminded the populace that everyone should take care of the least in his propaganda, which made it seem as though he was taking on all of the world's problems. Based on these proverbs, he adopted the nickname, All for One. Before, a mysterious figure claimed to have the power of one for all, taking his own suffering and giving it to everyone else, or being one master for all the slaves that made up the rest of the human race, or any of the other stories that people made up as time passed and the original events faded into history. It appeared as though he would usher in a new era of peace and justice. However, the person who wielded this power turned out to be a formidable villain, regardless of the name. The cycle would then repeatedly repeat itself after he was stopped. Shortly after that, another who claimed to have the same power appeared and rallied the world's villains to his cause. Every time, while fighting alongside the heroes, and later heroes as it developed into a government-funded profession with formal rules and regulations, All for One would defeat the purported wielders of this enigmatic power. Long-lived because of a quirk he had chosen for himself early in his career, he was able to push back the darkness and be a ray of hope repeatedly until the reign of All Might, the eighth man to claim the title of One for All. Oh, in the eyes of the public, history was repeated once more when All for One defeated All Might in a titanic battle, but those who knew him well knew that although All for One won the final battle with All Might, he was so horribly wounded that he would never fully recover even with the help of healing quirks. He was positive there would be a ninth, and he did not believe he could defeat one. In defiance of a desire he had had since the birth of his son, he ultimately made the decision to let the boy grow up to be a professional hero and assume the role he feared he could no longer play. Izuku was going about his business down the street when the building in front of him was smashed by the foot of a huge woman. If rumors were to be believed, then one of his closest classmates had turned into a villain. He looked up in horror and saw that what he saw was, indeed, a woman who had a quirk that allowed her to grow larger very quickly without appearing to lose strength from the pressure of maintaining her new size. A part of him wanted to pull out his notebook and write down all the different theories that came to him in light of this discovery. However, the more astute part of him considered the fact that she was not one of the well-known pro-heroes of their era, was obviously using her quirk without a license, and was wearing a menacing white outfit that was obviously intended to frighten any onlookers. He would know from his obsessions and from his father's control over the whole system. Izuku Shigaraki was looking at a villain right now. He suspected that writing notes would not be the best course of action at this time, or at the very least, it would be far less ideal than running and hiding like a maniac, since the villain in question could likely crush him like a bug. The woman yelled, "Hey, Kamui, we've got a runner," as multiple wooden spears pierced the concrete around Izuku, trapping him. Upon closer inspection, the wooden man who had constructed Izuku's current cage stopped talking. "Do we really have to take out everyone you see, Mountain? Keeping up these traps just for," he said. "Holy crap, that's All for One's brat?" "Wait, what?" the enormous woman said, glancing down at the boy. She appeared to respond to her own query without waiting for her partner's response, asking, "Should we let him go?" A stream of green slime slammed into her mouth and silenced her. "No, it's time we showed these damn heroes that just because All Might be down for the count, doesn't mean we have to be afraid of," she said. She was interrupted by a huge glob of green slime with humanoid eyes and sharp teeth, which were the only characteristics that set him apart from the shapeless blob. "Villains like you should be afraid," she said. Izuku stared in wonder despite his growing panic. It was Sludge Hero, an unimaginative name. Ranking number 31 and growing quickly. The life-threatening circumstance around him was still a bit of a distraction, even though he really wanted to pull out his notebook and record any observations. Before realizing that her accomplice was already 2 steps ahead of her, Mountain began to yell, "Kamui," as she removed the slime from her mouth. Regretfully, he was not really getting anywhere. Without appearing to do any significant damage, every wooden tool he made simply sliced through Sludge Hero's gelatinous flesh. Rolling her eyes, Mountain took a step forward, saw that the buildings around her were limiting her space, and kicked them until they fell. It took a while, long enough for Sludge Hero to seize Kamui's arms, slide up them, and swallow the wooden villain whole. I have your comrade under my control, villain, and if you care about him at all, then surrender, said the Poli. Mountain kicked him. Kamui fled, gasping for air and yelling about what a bitch his partner was. You could handle that, was her only response. Now, let's throw out the gunk. Stain was conflicted. On the one hand, he had already concluded that Mountain and Kamui's rampage was a smokescreen set up by Backdraft to rob the local banks without raising suspicion. After all, the lost money could be attributed to the chaos caused by the destroyed buildings, and Mountain and Kamui could always play it off as if they were just threatening the area, not stealing, so would there even be a proper investigation? And on the other hand, he felt obligated as a hero to bring the real criminals to justice. Of course, there was the trivial and mostly unimportant matter that he was on probation for excessive brutality, which was ridiculous because the only way to permanently destroy that long-standing criminal family was to cripple the current ingenium. As a result, he shouldn't be doing hero work at the moment, but wasn't that when being a hero truly mattered? When society said you shouldn't, wasn't that when you should? He was drawing his blades to give Sludge Hero some support when he finally caught a glimpse of Backdraft walking around idly with an overly big bag of cash. He was about to grudgingly leave it alone for the time being because the other two were obviously a far bigger threat, but then he saw the girl. Control your unnatural desires. Control your creepy urges, she thought. Come on, it's easy. It's normal. Himiko Toga had been doing so well, too, until she mentioned to her parents that she might, just might, apply to UA and perhaps pursue a career where she could actually use her quirk. Her father had screamed about how disappointed he was in her. Her mother had been kinder on the outside, putting an arm around Himiko's shoulder and sobbing, saying, I wish things could have been different, but in reality, she was far crueler than any of her father's yells. Her mother didn't want things to be different. She wanted Himiko Toga to be different. She had to accept that she couldn't be a hero. When two villains began destroying the neighborhood, the girl was lost in her thoughts in an alleyway near a local bank. She should have left as soon as possible, and she most certainly would have, had her lifelong curse not manifested itself. It was so beautiful that she found herself salivating despite herself. Damn it, this is why you can't be a hero, she thought. How can you rescue people when all you can think of is this? A wounded civilian staggered out of a bank that had been destroyed, broken, bruised, and bleeding. The man stumbled toward her and gasped, please, help me, saying, I need a doctor, an ambulance, something. Now, to just kill off that one teller that oh so kindly ensured the vault would be open whether Mountain's foot helped or not, and, I've got the damn plan down, you annoying geezer. He stumbled and fell onto her, spilling some of his blood onto her face. I want to blow up banks the next time. Perhaps you would if today's performance had been normal. Where had that teller gone now? Himiko's mind raced. This man before her was obviously the teller they had been talking about. He was going to die. His life had purpose, unlike hers. He was probably not some psychotic freak. The teller, in a presumed daze, did not question her. Instead, he simply staggered away as she licked at the blood on her face, enjoying the taste. At least I can die doing what I love, she thought, and doing some good at the same time. Is this what it feels like to be a hero? Shush, hide, she told him, I'll stop them from finding you. She changed and warped until she was a perfect replica of him, down to the clothes, after her quirk absorbed his blood into her body. Look, there you are, you jerk. Why were you attempting to flee from us? As sparks began to form on his palms, the younger boy, who had spiky blonde hair not too dissimilar from her own, smiled. The taller of them, dressed in a hideous parody of a firefighter's uniform, told the boy, don't waste time gloating. Finish him off, before raising a hose. Was it a part of his body? Was it his quirk? And rushing up a stream of pressurized water to blow him apart, just as a big knife slashed past him and into his arm. The fireman's suit stopped moving, clearly confusing his shorter companion, and a hero whom Himiko only dimly recognized leapt down to where the knife landed and licked it right away. Hey, Backdraft, how are you? Let's murder him. They weren't quick enough. The hero with the big knives charged at the blonde boy, who, to his credit, retaliated by igniting those sparks into full-fledged explosions. The hero jumped around the kid's bursts with amazing skill and speed, which infuriated the child and caused him to release even bigger explosions. So, as the hero approached the boy, he let out a blast that let him fly away. Remember this day. I'm going to become the most powerful villain, capable of beating you to death. His explosions were designed to carry him far from the battleground, even as he yelled threats. The hero said, "Damn, he's going too fast." He smirked and looked straight at Himiko, bank teller, saying, "You did good, girl. I can't get to him without risking backdraft getting up." When Sludge Hero landed on a small fire that had been started by the damage the two villains had caused earlier, he immediately put it out with a simple touch. "Okay, I can't puppet someone's body if their mass is too much larger than my own. Good to know." The hero began to tell himself as he attempted to crawl up mountain and force himself into her mouth, only to be spat out right away. Izuku got an idea after seeing that. "Sludge Hero, keep me safe," he yelled. "Kid, I'm trying, no, but I do have a plan for defeating these two. Suck me inside of you, get me out of this cage, and follow my lead." Sludge Hero ducked and weaved around Kamui's branch spears and Mountain's feet as he grasped the child and absorbed him into his viscous body, more out of desperation than because he was actually prone to trusting an untrained teen, even all for one's son, with strategy. Izuku was having trouble breathing. He hadn't thought of that, to be honest, but Hero followed him as he pointed Sludge, passing directly over a gas main that had been exposed earlier by the two renegades, and then, when Sludge Hero made holes in Kamui's body to avoid the wood user's next blow, spilling highly flammable material into the air, Kamui stabbed right into it. Now that he understood exactly what the child was saying, Sludge Hero yelled, "If I were you, I wouldn't cause any sparks. I can manage it perfectly, but you too." Kamui appeared frightened, and Mountain simply laughed and kicked a heap of rubble that was made up of metal rafters and solid concrete blocks at them. Not 2 blocks away, a huge fireball engulfed the sky, leaving one to wonder if Endeavor had emerged from hiding. Stain was tying up Backdraft to prevent the villain from escaping as soon as his bloodcurdle wore off, and he started to wonder if the explosion kid from earlier wasn't still around. Stain would reserve judgment on whether the hero had truly checked for civilians before deciding on such a plan, but for the moment he had to talk to the shocked young girl. The image of that mountain woman's falling, severely injured body made him realize that it was just a matter of Sludge Hero deciding that desperate times called for reckless measures. You put your life in danger to save someone else's. What was your real strategy? Were you able to take those two? She cast an awkward glance down. Instead of him, I intended to die. He didn't have a way of outrunning them, and I didn't have a way of beating them. He could only survive, in my opinion, if they believed he was already dead. Stain looked at her with no regard for her own life, only for the lives of others, and without any hesitation, she took action. Have you ever thought about becoming a hero? She appeared surprised by the question. My quirk is to, well. You consume blood, correct? She appeared embarrassed. So do I. She became more alert as he said, and you're right, you're never going to top the official charts or make the big bucks with such a quirk affecting your image, but only the undeserving give a damn. Well, with some combat skills, at least. He rubbed his chin. If you want to help people, then you have what it takes. My quirk isn't really a fighting, and we learned from Eraserhead's Reign of Terror what happens to people who only use their peculiarities to enhance their fighting skills. You have the right motivation and your quirk is helpful. If you can learn to fight, you'll fit in. You think I can have a job where I use my quirk? She said, surprised. Where can I avoid acting as though it doesn't exist? Where can I just be myself? Yes, Stain shrugged, if you're prepared to put in the effort and hold yourself to values that are actually important. I'm not interested in helping someone who just wants money and prestige, but you probably don't want those things. Will you assist me? As I said, only if you're willing to work for it. Although Izuku's analysis that Sludge Hero's body would shield him from the heat and flames was accurate, it hadn't completely shielded him from the shockwave. Yes, it had cushioned the blow, but not enough to completely prevent the pain and tingling. Izuku was holding himself in agony and gasping for air as Sludge Hero dropped him onto the street. Hey, kid, if you had explained what you were aiming for, I probably wouldn't have done that. The threat to civilians. Every civilian had left the area. I checked before suggesting it. It wasn't totally a lie because he had searched for that. However, Izuku couldn't say whether there were any in range because he didn't know how big the explosion would be until it actually happened. All for One had always made it clear to him that sometimes sacrifices were required for the greater good. Wow, kid, it wasn't a great plan, but you thought of it while you were stuck, not freaking out, and you saw what you needed in all that chaos. Also, from what I remember, your dad hasn't allowed you to pick up any quirks yet, so you're pretty much quirkless, right? Izuku nodded, and Sludge Hero whistled. Everyone will say that your dad is the only reason you got into UA, kid. They will argue that a largely oddball child could not have gone there on his own. I just wanted to let you know that you truly deserve whatever moniker you choose for yourself in the hero world if what I witnessed today was typical. He was truly moved to tears by that, since Sludge Hero hadn't thought to explain how the third villain was stopped or even why he was there. Hero Public Safety Commission figured it out and brought him to task. Stain was perfectly happy to let Sludge Hero take all the credit for the 3 arrests that day, but Backdraft was in much better shape than Mountain and Kamui. The latter required several medical examinations to confirm he wasn't dead, and the medics weren't sure he would make it. The fact that they used the lack of violence against his victim as proof that he was engaging in unapproved hero work after being punished for excessive brutality only made him grind his teeth more than he would normally do around these individuals. Therefore, you broke the terms of your probation even though you stopped a wanted criminal and might have saved the life of a civilian girl. We have guidelines. Indeed, he was well aware of their rules. He was not a supporter of the Meta Liberation Party, but he also had a great idea of where those rules and regulations could be placed. Understood, he spat out, and I think you won't even try to look into the possibility that the bad guys could be cooperating? Is this just another tirade about how a talking mouse is actually in charge of all organized villainy? Damn it, Nedzu is real. And I am talking about how villains are banding together, recruiting more young people, and getting worse in general, he said, ignoring their amused smirks as he continued. We are aware of the issues our society is facing. That's why we haven't revoked your teaching license yet, despite everything. However, a short spike in crime does not excuse you from behaving as though our warnings were a slap on the wrist after severing the spine of a criminal who had already been apprehended. Understood, he replied, managing the bile in the back of his throat. I'll make an effort to be more cautious. It wasn't that he didn't understand their position. There were undoubtedly heroes out there who lacked the discernment to know when to use violence and when an arrest was more appropriate, but he personally believed that was the problem of others. His convictions were serious, so he could trust his own judgment. Experience had taught him that argument wouldn't work with these men, so he bit his tongue and decided to be content with still having some influence over the next generation of heroes. He had even heard that All for One's child was competent, which really surprised him. He had half expectable. All for One wasn't really listening when the reporters discussed this year's rankings. It was largely the same as most years. Destro had the performance to get number 2, but his outspoken politics turned too many against him to keep up in the popularity polls. The boss was similar. He managed his hero agency like an actual agency, doing better than practically anyone on the sides of hero work that most never saw, like managing villain reform programs and selling quirk regulator drugs to help out those with less controllable powers, but he refused to give in to image at all. He basically thought heroes should return to the days of policemen and SWAT teams handling everything, and held nothing but disdain for this newfangled flashy, comic book style work. So he wore nothing but a suit when out amongst the public, and lost so much image for it. That his adopted son was considered one of the up-and-coming sidekicks to look out for, but got that position while explicitly rejecting the boss's philosophy, did not help matters at all. A number of people would argue that Magna's numbers were being inflated to get LGBT representation in the top spots, while others would argue that she was being pushed down from where she actually deserved for the exact opposite reason. It was all very tiresome. Curious would receive votes for her media appearances rather than her actual work, then lose them due to resentment from the other reporters who hated how she could get coverage on villain fights they couldn't. Muscular would start another debate about heroic brutality. He held the top spot because he was, in effect, the god of Japan. He was aware that this was a very conceited title, but he felt that he deserved it and that it was only used for good. He was a god in the sense of a moral role model to aspire to. A judge to be feared only when one was evil, and not a person to be blindly worshipped. He liked to think that he had performed well enough to fulfill this duty. So, when the meeting was cut short, he was almost excited, but when he heard what had happened to his son, his excitement turned to dread as people fought over who would get what number stuck next to their name in the next series of magazines. Izuku insisted, "Mom, I'm fine," while the woman mentioned above caressed each scrape and bruise. Some of the most heinous criminals on the loose attacked you. You're definitely not okay. Their brief argument was cut short when the door burst inward, and she answered before bandaging a small itch that really didn't require one. "How is my son doing?" A voice of fear yelled. As a matter of fact, Izuku felt a little guilty about that. His father was usually so stoic and self-assured, partly because of the face he maintained for the public's benefit but also because time had left him with little to truly fear, so it was unusual to hear him sound afraid. The boy felt uneasy because he was one of the few things that could actually make the man feel afraid again. Without even hinting at the apparent change in attitude from just seconds earlier, Inko Shigaraki told her husband, "He's fine. No thanks to a certain decision to keep him from defending himself." We don't know for sure whether his quirk is exactly the same as mine, and if it isn't then, as I learned in a lot of incidents that the history books don't like to focus on, giving quirks to someone who wasn't born with them can have a lot of unforeseen dangers, all for one side. They had discussed this topic numerous times before, and Izuku suspected he had grown tired of it long ago. Furthermore, it would only make him a target. Izuku was silenced by her severe expression, which included a sharp look at his current roughed-up appearance. But I have been re-evaluating this position, she said. According to Sludge Hero's report, you demonstrated the proper mindset when under pressure to perform hero work. Although I wish it hadn't been demonstrated in this manner, I am really proud of you and believe it's time for you to begin training to become a pro hero if you still truly want to. There was a hint of nervousness in his voice at the last part, but Izuku was too overwhelmed to respond. This had been a lifelong dream of his, interrupted only by two things. His father forbade him from testing whether or not he had inherited his quirk, and no others had appeared, so he was effectively quirky for the majority of his life. It had turned his childhood friend Katsuki Bakugo against him once that same child actually became impressed by All Might's reign of terror and began to develop quirk supremacist ideas that made him a vicious bully before he abruptly dropped out of middle school to become the #1 villain. He was resented by the others because he was both the son of the #1 hero, making him a privileged youth in theory, and someone they denigrated as helpless. It was as if he wasn't supposed to have both traits at once, or they were jealous of the first and could get away with a lot because of the second. But the important thing was that one simply didn't become a pro hero without a useful quirk. No one would recommend him to a good hero school without one, unless, well, maybe that was the second thing that put a stop to his dreams. Eraserhead had taught many a now dead hero that, but it was important. Even if he had a proven powerful quirk, his father presumably would not have allowed him to become one because of some twisted notion of protecting him. Few were going to disobey the #1 hero and god of Japan. What has changed? Izuku was hesitant to ask for fear that it would cause the man to change his mind, but All for One just sighed. Whether you choose to work as a hero or not, you will undoubtedly be in danger. That's what I now realize. Also, I'm not working to my full potential. I was exhausted by the last one for All Wielder. We need strong heroes for that day because I won't be able to stop the next one. You know, Dad, maybe this was the last one. I mean, how many powers can these villains make up? Izuku and Inko both stared at him in fear. One for all is real, said All for One, shaking his head. I can't bring myself to tell you everything just yet, but one day I'll tell you the tale of how that quirk truly originated. This isn't just the experience of a man who has battled it repeatedly. Wait, you, one day, but not today, he said, but for now, you just need to make up your mind. Would you like to show UA and confront the Nomus? What you can do on your own, or would you prefer that I share suggestions with you? You fled, then? The green-haired man's stance was not going to intimidate Lord Explosion Murder. I left the damn geezers you sent with me to their fate after evaluating the situation and determining that they were incapable of handling true heroes. Those fools received their just desserts. Furthermore, couldn't you have predicted this event by looking into my future or something? Backdraft was an accomplished criminal with several good years of labor under his belt. The man smirked, ignoring Lord Explosion Murder's question. Maybe you were right to leave squawking like a headless chicken if he was taken down. I suppose he saw that in you. I'll murder you, in response, Lord Explosion Murder said. Very impetuous. With that mindset, you'll never be able to outperform All Might. It's nice to have fantasies about the future, but not that you would have anyhow. Believe me, I wish I had that kind of luxury. You did escape when more seasoned criminals failed, and this next plan will give you an opportunity to test out your leadership skills, he said, letting out a sigh and taking out some documents. He threw 4 folders in front of Bakugo and said, Poison Dart Frog, you'll be leading some forces in an operation we've wanted to try out for a while, and you'll be recruiting and testing some members even fresher than you. This cat burglar, who is no older than you and is good enough that she hasn't been caught once, is the one that English-language newspapers have begun referring to as Date Grape. Although the media hasn't given her a name, our sources claim that she likes the moniker Uravity. Oh, and it seems that Red Riot has drawn a copycat. We'll let you make the decisions for roughly 12 other people that our employer is interested in if you can convince these 4 to join us. Bakugo disliked being given orders like this, especially from someone who was always subordinate to other villains, but it did sound nice to be given Henchman to lead. Before Himiko could even get to her feet, Stain yelled, again. Knowing better than to complain, she pushed her legs back and threw herself out of the way as his blades came hurtling down the exact spot where her head had been less than a second before, that is, right next to it. Stain didn't waste time practicing with fake blades, but he still wasn't to kill her over a training exercise, at least not in her opinion. It hurt her, yes, as several minor cuts could attest, but nothing seriously dangerous. He parried her blow at the last second, but she was proud that it was the last second. Many who were even a little slower would have been nicked. She didn't let such thoughts divert her as she ducked around his attacks to get her own scalpel right up to his neck. As long as she kept her creepier parts to herself in front of them, her parents could tolerate her trying her hand at being a hero, even though she still had the physique of a teenage girl and a quirk that, as far as she knew, didn't directly help with frontline combat. She could confidently say that her knife skills were superior to those of most pro heroes and seasoned thugs. Stain made a clear feint with his left hand before swinging with his right. She knew that the man was much more skilled at feinting than that, so she concentrated on avoiding the left and was rewarded with a grin of approval from Stain. A chance to drive her own right hand blade into his torso, which was again blocked at the last second, but Stain was more than willing to give up. I told you that if you put in the effort and kept your morals unadulterated, you could succeed. I'm sure you'll make a great hero, Himiko Toga. Actually, I think you'll be fine, but I should caution you that UA's entrance exams aren't exactly designed for people with non-direct combat quirks. Next week is the date. Are you prepared? Yes, Mr. Staney. It will be a lovely thing, in my opinion. Don't call me that, but you're right about the second part. Shuichi Iguchi awoke before noon, which is not typical, but his parents were upset about his 3 a.m. gaming once more and wouldn't let him stay on their dime until he demonstrated that he had tried hard enough to get into a high school. In fact, he had progressed far enough to apply to UA, where he would do everything in his power to convince his family that he had truly tried before plunging back into NEETDOM so they wouldn't be too hard on him. He wasn't physically fit enough to be an athlete, not intelligent enough to be a scientist or academic, he didn't have a good enough quirk to be a pro hero even as he tried out for the job, and he wasn't motivated enough to try to overcome any of those shortcomings. To be fair to him, it wasn't that he wanted to live his entire life as an empty loser, rather, it was that nothing else really appealed to him. He had long since accepted this aspect of himself, and he probably would until something somewhere managed to inspire him, though he doubted it. If everyone on the planet was a cell in the great body that was humanity, then he was at best an appendix cell that accomplished nothing but wasting space, and at worst a cancer cell that stole resources and gave only misery in return. He was studying for the notoriously difficult entrance exam at UA at this ungodly hour in the hopes that if he was at least in the top 50% of the rejected, they might not cut him off. However, he still wanted to eat because eating meant proving to his parents that he had worked hard before he leeched off them. Jiren was aware that he was supposed to be studying, but he couldn't resist venting to the quirk regulation activists who were demonstrating outside the Meta Liberation Party headquarters. "Set the eccentrics free." As they shouted back, he yelled, "End quirk supremacy. Don't get upset because yours is bad." The demonstrators were not to be intimidated, so he yelled back, much to the amusement of a few MLP supporters who were present. Indeed, let's eliminate all peculiarities so that crazy villains can do as they please. You fool. The reason villains are villains is because they already break the law. A good guy with a quirk is the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a quirk, and the closest pro hero is just minutes away when it matters most. A part of him was ready to fight with these losers, but he was also relieved that it didn't turn violent because he didn't want that on his record, especially with his UA entrance exams approaching. The protesters yelled some platitudes about equality and safety, and the MLP supporters shouted some platitudes about rights and freedoms. Although he philosophically disagreed with the notion that he should even have to go through the process, he would play nice for the time being because this was the world they lived in, with its intrusive, quirk-hating government. The only real threat to Shimura Tenko's admission to UA was probably his grandmother's identity, and he had already told himself multiple times that he was less likely to be rejected for it up front than to be expelled if he was found out later. Nevertheless, he still scratched himself all over with worry, wondering if he should have changed his name, but it was too late now. Though his charisma could use some bonuses and he wasn't even sure how to measure wisdom in real life, he had no doubt whatsoever that he would dominate the competition. It wasn't arrogant if it was true. His intelligence and dexterity stats were pretty impressive, and he hadn't abandoned strength or constitution. It was a personal choice. Izuku wanted to be absolutely certain that he got into UA on his own merits, not because he was his father's son. He knew this would make things harder at first, but ultimately he wanted to prove himself by himself. Prior to starting his hero's journey, Izuku had been offered one quirk of his choosing from his father's collection, which is why both parents were surprised that he was still quirkless. He just needed to figure out how to beat up some Nomus. It shouldn't be too difficult. He walked through the gates of UA with pride, ready to face a bright future, not so ready to face the concrete floor. Yes, he stumbled and fell face first as soon as he entered the sacred halls of his future. "Are you all right, dear?" He was at least a little calmer because someone had the decency to help him up, but that quickly faded when he realized how close he was to a real, breathing, and attractive girl. What was the expression on her face when she saw his face? It almost looked like desire. Blood rushed to his face. Himiko Toga was enthralled with the boy's face, not because of any particularly striking features, but because the concrete caused him to bleed just enough to be beautiful. She was hungry for what she saw, and as she gazed at it and smelled it, a pleasing flush came up her cheeks. There are 14 gems left. 10 is 599 yen, only with credit cards. In reaction to the odd interruption, they both turned to see a boy with blue hair and wrinkled, grayish skin who looked a little unsettling. "I'm sorry," he went on, "but I noticed that you guys were using our first day of school as a dating simulation. If you don't want to select any of the options that actually lead you to the bedroom, it looked like one of those cheap, free, mobile apps. However, if it's a PC version, feel free to carry on with your light novel conversation. I'll go on to the action-adventure section of that." For a totally different reason, Himiko Toga was blushing even more deeply now. She had been too thrilled by the unexpected sight to be self-conscious about how staring at a boy who was hurt and bleeding would appear to others, and after experiencing this particular self-consciousness for so long, she had never even thought about the possibility that the blushing and staring could be interpreted in a different way. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," she said, forcing out the speech she had to learn for her parents' benefit as she turned to face Izuku. He went on in this manner, descending into a pattern of unintelligible muttering. "No, it's okay. Really, you were really helpful. The way you noticed that I fell down and asked whether I was okay because I fell down and..." "Okay. Well, if there's no problem, then I guess we both have to go." Yeah, right. I guess I'll see you in there." "Sure." The two went into the school building, and although she had certainly not intended to look at him romantically, it had prevented her from feeling judged by what she was actually staring at, and even though it was awkward, it was good to talk to someone normally. Izuku took a few seconds to take it in. "I just spoke to a girl," and although he was certain there were countless other explanations, it seemed as though she was observing him. No, he needed to gather his thoughts and concentrate. The entrance exam was far from certain to pass if he wasn't depending on his father's advice or peculiarities. They were in for a big adjustment when they were taken to the ruined city, covered in blue marbles for some reason, to have the practical exam explained to them because the written test was fairly simple and completed with surprisingly little fanfare. With a flourish of his cane, the performing hero Mr. Compress shouted, "Welcome, my fine young prospects, to UA, the most prestigious academy in this half of the country, and I myself like to think the country in its entirety as well." Some of the children were wrapped in attention, while the majority were too agitated to really pay attention, and others, like Izuku, were simply impressed by how much he tried. It was particularly fascinating because his mask obscured his face, making it impossible to see his facial expression. "A few of you will succeed here, demonstrating your ability to reach for the stars and touch the sun. Here, you will discover your true self, your potential self, and how your name will be inscribed in history. Unfortunately, only a handful of you will burn hot enough to ignite the UA cloth. Acceptance, and most will have to seek their future elsewhere, but for those lucky few, you are about to prove yourselves worthy of taking an adventure that will..." Skip button for this tutorial. To the amusement of several of his peers, the same blue-haired boy who had earlier interrupted Izuku's meeting with the girl yelled out. Compress simply replied, "Very well, if you are so eager, then let's get started," with a slightly irritated expression, if one could read shoulders at all. Would anyone want to share their knowledge of nomus with the class so that those who are not familiar with the most recent findings in quirk genetic research can learn more? When Mr. Compress saw that All for One's very own son was prepared to speak, a number of kids put up their hands, hoping to be called upon, but none of them had much chance. They are genetically altered animals that have had numerous improvements made to their physical and neurological development. As a result, they are able to possess and utilize quirks, just like humans, but they are somewhat superior because they are able to use multiple quirks. Unfortunately, it affects their mental state because, aside from effectively using quirks, they are usually dumber than the animal from which they were created. This is the main reason why it is illegal to create human nomus, and fortunately, no villain can do so because All for One himself must give them a quirk as part of the process. Naturally, there is much more to the process than that, as Izuku Shigaraki was in the mood to share all the trivia and facts he had managed to commit to memory about the creatures over the years. Mr. Compress attempted to say, "Okay, I think that everyone has the idea, but Izuku persisted, saying, yes, that's quite enough. Despite this, Izuku continued by pointing out that Nomu cells had plant-like cell walls that preserved the membrane's flexibility. Enough. When Izuku finally sat down, completely embarrassed, a number of people snickered. Mr. Compress coughed to get the attention of the crowd again and flourished his cane, saying, several Nomu are rampaging throughout the city. Stopping as many as you can is your aim. The smallest variety receives 1 point, the larger ones receive 2, and the flying ones receive 3. Although there is a 4th form, I would advise ignoring it because it is not worth any points. Since these are vicious, dangerous animals, we have procedures in place to save your life if it is actually in danger, but if a staff member does it, you will lose a lot of points. But if a fellow applicant helps you, you lose nothing but maybe your pride. Have any inquiries? Villains don't give you an opportunity to ask questions before attacking, and we prepare you for the worst here. Mr. Compress snapped his fingers, causing the hundreds of blue marbles that were scattered across the ground to warp into blue lights. Some people raised their hands, but his mask pushed itself up as if he were grinning. Despite Mr. Compress's assurances regarding a rescue plan, Himiko Toga was fairly certain that if she had spent even a week or so less training with Staney, she would have died immediately when a Nomu's claws struck at her neck. Shifting her neck to the side was a reflex built up by avoiding his knives, and the quick thinking he had instilled in her was the reason she thought to quickly run her scalpel across its neck while its lunge left it in a vulnerable position. She had been grateful to Staney since she had first met him, but never more so than in that moment. Toga didn't really know whether or not she could even copy a Nomu, but it would be more than enough to risk the time wasted on a no if she found out the answer was yes. Still, she had to rely on her own talents as well if she hoped to pass this exam, so she leapt to where she had just opened a wound in the creature and bit into it. Savoring the taste of the beautiful wonder she was always forced to deny herself. As he swerved around the 4th Nomu to attack him, he only had to dodge it once before he got his hands on it and it rotted away. I'm not supposed to do that to human villains, Tenko thought, and he wasn't really sure how well this was simulating his future pro-hero work because what he always thought would be his biggest obstacle was actually turning out to be his biggest boon. According to the official rules, he was passing this exam as easily as he had anticipated, but it wouldn't surprise him in the least if there were a secret test inside the test. Perhaps they just had to defeat the Nomus like they would other villains, instead of defeat them. If he wanted to be accepted, he would therefore need to figure out a way to use his quirk that didn't just involve killing off his opponents. There was obviously something about that 4th kind. Any real achievement hunter understood what it meant when an objective was marked as optional, and he had every intention of removing that one himself, whatever the secret was. But where was it? Allowing such thoughts to divert his attention allowed a flying Nomu to approach him without his awareness. Had a lizard boy crawling on a nearby wall not leapt on it and sent it hurtling in a different direction, it would have easily knocked him to the ground, if not worse. After saying, thanks for the assist, Tenko looked at the wall the lizard boy had just leapt off of and felt suddenly motivated. Hey, you, I have an idea, he said. Do you believe that many of them will attempt to pursue you? Shuichi Eguchi stared at the boy he had just saved as if he were crazy, which was understandable given that Shuichi was fairly sure he was. When the Nomus began to attack, his first instinct was to flee, just like a gecko would. He was already a little stunned from falling to the ground with the creature, and now this madman wanted him to be bait. He used his quirk to crawl up the side of a nearby wall, and he had to tell himself repeatedly, at least 7 times, that his parents wouldn't approve if he half-assed it and hid away the entire time, before he noticed the flying Nomu heading for the gray-skinned boy and leapt without thinking. You can make them run to the walls and scale them if they're pursuing you. You do recall that strange kid saying that they are less intelligent than animals? You can place them on or beneath the building, and I can use my special ability to demolish the supporting structures so that the building falls directly on top of them. You will have no trouble getting away with your quirk. Even though it still sounded like a bad idea, he needed something to say after failing. As it turned out, Himiko Toga could actually transform into a Nomu, which should have been fantastic, and initially it was, as it gave her the strength to rip into the other beasts as well as a scent that led them to believe she was one of them and not attack her on their own. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones who didn't recognize her as a Nomu. As she used the Nomu's strength and speed to avoid multiple ice shards thrown at her by a boy in an Eskimo suit, she thought, I've heard of competitive testing, but this is just ridiculous. She then swiftly pulled her leg away from another boy in a white cloth outfit who was actually attempting to eat her. Fortunately, the Nomu whose form she had adopted appeared to have some sort of heat-generating quirk, and she managed to repel both of their attacks long enough to escape behind a nearby building. Seeing that same boy work on the other Nomu actually helped her understand why she slightly repulsed other people. Wait, did I just use the quirk of another form? So, when she changed into someone else, she also took on their quirk? I guess it made sense biologically, since her quirk, among other things, absorbed other people's DNA to create its forms, and quirks were a part of people, she thought, but she had tried before and it had failed. Would Nomus eventually be able to copy both bodies and quirks? Why, she'd be a mini all for one. How was that for the eerie girl? Had she simply changed, or had she become stronger? Many quirks changed as one developed and strengthened them. Having seen live experiments on the creatures with his father, Izuku was aware that he was lagging behind. He was able to take advantage of this by using a broken piece of metal from a nearby collapsed building to smash into the creature that had managed to jump him. After that, his performance was all running and hiding, and although he refused to give up, it appeared that he might risk dying if he continued, and for what? The fact that a surprisingly large swarm of Nomus was chasing after a scared boy with some weird lizard quirk interrupted his moping, but it didn't give him any ideas until the same lizard boy led them up a building that instantly collapsed when another prospective student touched it. He wasn't scoring, and he wasn't thinking of how he could. We don't lose anything if we're saved by another examinee, Izuku thought, we're supposed to work together. Lizard Boy was able to jump away and find another perch just in time. He believed he was good at planning. Perhaps he could find a partner here somewhere before the test ended. It was doubtful that they'd be able to fill 2 entire classes, but the men watching the screen were both impressed and disappointed because so few of this year's examinees were actually doing anything. Kurogiri had to warp 1 that he missed, and Mr. Compress saved 2 lives as they were thinking it. I got choreo. Quirk, ice manipulation. The boy in question created a solid block around a Nomu's foot, allowing him to knock it down as the man enumerated his traits. Above average academic performance. The way he applied his quirk in practice was praised by his teachers. Additionally, it appears that he volunteers, political volunteer work. Many of the spectators stifled a shiver. Shimura Tenko. Oddity. Decomposition. He excelled in elementary school, missed a number of years because of a classified incident, and began to fall behind in middle school because he was bored. He quickly improved his situation after learning the prerequisites for admission to this institution. The boy in question knocked down a building as the man was speaking, eliminating multiple Nomus. Abe Musatado. Oddity. Gas. Stain expelled him last year, but he was permitted to re-enroll when he was in a better mental place, in contrast to the majority of his former pupils. A child wearing a gas mask from World War I yelled that despite all the excitement surrounding them, sleeping Nomus weren't all that special as he killed off several of them, laughing at what seemed to be nothing in particular. A second person in the room said, I'm not sure if he's there yet. I've had my eyes on these 3, and all for one's son, of course, but honestly he hasn't impressed me thus far. Another person in the room commented, I see about 10 that have real potential thus far. Stain's little protege hasn't been doing too badly herself. Why not send out the 4th type? I know we usually aim for 40. Had Garaki and Dad resumed their experiments on humans? Izuku was trying to convince someone, anyone, to listen to his idea to team up when the wall next to him exploded. It was a Nomu, and it looked different from the others. It still had the elongated mouth and exposed brains that marked all of them, but it stood on its hind legs and kept its forearms upright, just like a human. The only warning anyone received before it leapt was that it was staring at the students with a hungry expression, and that was more important at this precise moment than the ethics governing the question. Some of the examinees were alarmed when one of the kids punched it with some quirk-enhanced strength, but the Nomu acted as though the kid hadn't touched him, picked him up, and threw him around like a rag doll, breaking several bones audibly before Mr. Compress leapt down, turned the boy into a marble, and then left to allow the Nomu to move on to the other students. As they ran from the beast, Izuku nearly got caught up in the rush, but he forced himself to remain composed and think. He needed more points. He couldn't let the test end this way without doing a little more, so he would have to find a way to get past this obstacle. It was you who mentioned collaborating with others. Normie, do you actually have a plan? The blue-haired boy who had earlier accused him of being the main character in a romance mobile game startled him with his sudden appearance, but he immediately resumed his processing. Well, we can't just give up the exam now. Oh, of course. The oldest hidden achievement trick in the book is just ignore the 4th type, which is worth 0 points. It's obvious that we should stop it anyhow. The blue-haired boy piped up, I could just rot away a building to fall on it, but Izuku had not been thinking along those lines at all, and now he could sort of see it. If you assist me, They might count it toward your score even though I already have a guy to serve as bait. No, Izuku said. It paid no attention to that kid's earlier attack, and it wasn't just too tough, it didn't even react. It has a shock absorption, I believe, so blunt force trauma wouldn't work at all, and a falling building is too unpredictable to have a sharp object get inside of it. The boy quickly retorted, well, I can't rot it away directly without it getting close enough to rip my head off, in frustration. What if the ground was rotted? As he did so, the humanoid Nomu, recognizing that the two were the only potential prey in the area not running for it, leapt toward them, claws outstretched, and the blue-haired boy shoved the green-haired boy aside, following the latter's instructions. When the fourth type was introduced, Himiko Toga was initially happy because it meant that the other examinees were fleeing while she, safe from arousing the other Nomu's aggressive instincts in her current form, could slaughter and gain points to her heart's content. She doubted that this would last for long because some other examinees who were low on points would undoubtedly still risk going for it, but then she realized that adopting the form of the fourth type might actually protect her from both threats because no one would pursue the one worth 0 points, after all. Before the fourth type, stuck in concrete from the waist down, managed to swing out its arms and strike at the two boys, she decided to drop the form of the current Nomu so she wouldn't be attacked by the two kids who had just immobilized the fourth type while she got close enough to try and take its form. She dashed to where she heard the examinees screaming and running, only to find the very creature she was looking for falling through and getting stuck in mysteriously weak concrete. Green hair, plain skin was flung into the air, blood gushing from the gash it had made on his chest, straight into her, and as he fell on top of her, the blood spattered on her face, and she became suddenly thirsty. Optics be damned, she could not help but drive her quirk-generated fangs into his wounds, draining him of everything he was worth. Blue hair, gray skin barely avoided it, sustaining a minor cut across his face. As the Nomu escaped the trap he had set with the green-haired boy's inspiration, Tenko stumbled on the ground, barely keeping his composure as the creature escaped, and he was not prepared to deal with it charging straight for him. Tenko attempted to grab onto the Nomu's arm and disintegrate it, but he only managed to get down to its elbow before it sent him, and its own decomposing limb, flying. Had the same lizard boy from earlier not tackled him out of the way, Tenko Shimura would have either died or turned into a marble at that very moment. Grab onto me, the reptilian teenager yelled before crawling up a wall with Tenko hanging from his back. Because prey was prey and it ate prey, it was going to continue chasing the prey even if it didn't have the means to do so right away. However, when it saw other prey on the ground, it attempted to eat it instead because there were two of the same prey. Izuku didn't know why he was now two, but he attributed it to blood loss when he saw the Nomu approaching him. The claws on one arm were outstretched, and the stump of the other arm was outstretched as though it were attempting to attack him with its claws. That stump is vulnerable because it has an open wound. He could hardly think clearly because of the fog that was obscuring his vision. In his dazed state, he attempted to snatch one of the scalpels the other had dropped and drive it into the quickly approaching exposed stump, but he lacked coordination, skill, and aim. The other him, recognizing what he was attempting to do, took the scalpel from him, twirled it, and drove it into the open wound the decay quirk had left on the Nomu just before it slammed into his face. He was going to miss with his unsteady hand. Izuku watched himself begin to drink its blood as the creature screamed in agony, and then the other him leapt onto the Nomu and bit into it. It was the final scene before the cumulative pain, wounds, and exsanguination of the previous few minutes became too much for him to handle, and he passed out. So, who removed it? All for One's son or the shape-shifting girl? The shape-shifting girl, obviously, but the video can be altered to make it seem as though it was the #1 hero's heir. For my part, I don't intend to bar the child from entering. With differing degrees of reluctance, the others accepted the obvious partiality and talked among themselves about which students performed well enough to pass. For the sake of others, Asui had never been one to conceal her feelings or change the way she spoke. It was both a boon and a bane, primarily the latter, but she managed to control it for once. The pro-hero Kraken defeated Selkie's gang after they had worked tirelessly for years to get goods past the Coast Guard. She didn't miss the fact that it happened so soon after she joined, but she also couldn't really blame it on herself. Poison Dart Frog remained composed and refused to divulge any information or assist the hero in his scheme to coerce Selkie into coming out when Kraken captured the majority of the gang, including herself, because no one could resist the pro's power except Selkie. The only embarrassing aspect of her performance was that Selkie, once he actually showed up prepared to fight, lost along with the rest of the group. Yes, normally she would be inclined to comment on this, perhaps without intending to, or make a direct remark to her failed associates or insult Kraken. However, she realized that Kraken felt sorry for her when he recognized how young she was, so he chose to play into that by adopting the pitiful appearance of one of those normal girls from her high school, crying over trivial matters, and manipulating her emotions to ensure that she only displayed what she wanted to show. In fact, it was simpler than she had anticipated. She might have been able to act normally and make friends. She only used the late blooming skill to gain some space from Kraken, which she then used to jump off the motionless ship and swim for it. Oh well, that ship had already sailed a long time ago. Poison Dart Frog crawled up onto the neighboring shore, content that she had managed to escape, for the time being, and had time to consider her next course of action. Although she wasn't sure she had the repertoire to get there, Gang Orca might be recruiting. It would probably be best to keep quiet and wait for the situation to subside before taking any significant action at this time. She was about to take off her green costume with sporadic black specks to match her namesake. Her quirk had nothing to do with it. She only possessed the abilities of a normal frog. But Poison Dart Frog was the only moniker she could think of to make a frog quirk sound menacing. When she was abruptly stopped by sparks lighting up the sky behind her. She was about to strike when she noticed a stranger wearing an outfit similar to her own. Did he have grenades for hands? He asked, a little unsurely. Hey, are you Venom Arrow Toad? The absurdity of the question stopped her in her tracks. Poison Dart Frog, was her thoughtless response. Yeah, I've been looking for you. She didn't wait for him to finish before jumping up and slashing out her tongue, only to have the stranger's hand explode, sending a shockwave that knocked her jump off angle and a burst of heated air straight into her tongue. She assumed she was correct about the grenade hands because the boy in question was unharmed by the explosion. Man, quirks could get weird. The boy yelled, "Stop trying to flee or I'll kill you, damn it." As she barely landed on her feet, she thought, that doesn't sound like a hero. I'm here to give you an offer. The guy that, well, I'm working for him now but he'll be my underling soon enough, but anyways, he thinks you'd make a good henchman for some reason, and so I am. Being gracious and generous and all, offering to let you serve someone amazing like me. Asui gazed at him for a few moments, a little taken aback that he appeared to be proud of that sales pitch. That might actually be the stupidest offer I have ever heard ribbit. And this is coming hours after a pro-hero offered to have my jail time in exchange for betraying one of the most ruthless crime lords I know, ribbit. This Toad girl was really annoying Lord Explosion Murder, but he had no idea what was supposed to make her so special that both his temporary boss and that guy's own boss were interested in her. She was already there, so it didn't take much to irritate him. Okay, henchman, if you want me to beat you into submission, then I prefer that to talking anyway. Once more, she attempted to leap away, this time in the direction of the water. Knowing that she was likely a much faster swimmer than he was, he replied, "Oh no you don't," focusing on the perspiration that had accumulated in his gauntlets until it was ready to ignite and aiming them exactly where he could see she was going to land. She was positive that she would avoid any explosions he threw at her now that she knew what he was capable of, and it was true. Sadly, despite his excessively combative demeanor and lack of fundamental social skills, he did possess the awareness to identify this weakness and the foresight to make up for it with the most straightforward, yet rarely considered, of strategies. Instead of shooting at her location, he chose to target her where she was going to be. Since it was technically impossible to change direction in midair, the majority would have been caught, if one didn't have a very powerful prehensile tongue, that is. She spat her special appendage out at the closest rock formation as the water exploded beneath her, and she pulled herself out of the way of the upward spurt of heated water he had created at the last second, ignoring the pain from the burns he had given it earlier. She didn't even notice him recalculate and detonate a smaller explosion at her new landing site, feeling a little smug about having escaped his trick. Too confused by the shockwave to concentrate her tongue again, she thought, damn it, as she was launched into the air. She barely made it to her feet after flailing around, but before she could orient herself, the man with the grenade hands yelled, "Are you ready to accept your place, henchman, or are you ready to die?" She was just considering the possibility that this obviously unstable boss might be her best bet for a job until she could slip out once more when a loud, businesslike, but squeaky voice interrupted them. Asui thought, damn it, Kraken found me. It's surprising that the entire Coast Guard hasn't arrived given all the explosions. Did I just spend a single night taking down 2 of my gangs? I was too busy to attend the second one. This damn Toad was going to feel the full force of Lord Explosion Murder's recent buildup to what could be his biggest explosion to date because he forced him to endure all this bullshit. Night Eyes could later complain about her death. In any case, he failed to see what made her so unique. But a dumb pro-hero arrived to figure out what was going on because this night just wanted to make him worse and worse. Foolish heroes. All Might had forced them to reveal their true selves. And Lord Explosion Murder had every intention of surpassing All Might in terror in the future. When tentacles appeared, he launched the developed attack intended for Toxic Bolt Nude directly at the unwary intruder. Was Kraken just transformed into calamari by him? Perhaps this one is worth staying for. The pro-hero suffered terrible injuries but was not defeated. Just enough to allow Lord Explosion Murder to flee before tentacles could summon help. He gave killing the octopus some serious thought because, after all, he couldn't have been a very skilled pro-hero to be caught off guard by such a simple attack, and he might not have been significant enough for others to take seriously. No, it wasn't worth the heat. He did realize that someone was pursuing him as he made his escape, not a run, but a calculated retreat. Before asking, he waited a few blocks away so that he wouldn't be instantly connected to the fried squid on the beach. So, Froppy, you finally learned your place? Diseased Bullet Amphibian whimpered, "Oh, come on, that's the worst fake name you've given me, Ribbit." "Well, you're gonna have to be a much better henchman if you want me to remember your actual name, Froppy, and I'm out of memory tricks." This was something she was already beginning to regret. 3 adolescent girls talked among themselves about the boys they liked, the newest rumors, and clothes. The person who was watching them the most was particularly bothered by that last one. The boys were always of the same type. He was tall, charismatic, and naturally gifted. Genetics in a harsh, gynocentric society condemned him to a life of celibacy and wretched solitude. Then screw society. Of those two, the second could be fixed. After realizing she couldn't find her wallet, one of the girls left her 2 friends and walked away. While she was doing this, she noticed the cutest kitten in a nearby alleyway, lying by itself on a newspaper. "Aren't you just the cutest thing?" she crooned as she approached to attempt to pet it. She became braver and approached it head-on, ignoring everything around her, until she was close enough to kneel down and pet it as it mewed warmly. It gave a cheerful response. "Ah," she continued to coo. She stood up and shrugged resignedly, but her left foot wouldn't move. "I almost want to take you home with me, but I don't think my parents would want that," she said. She was even more perplexed when she noticed a purple ball next to it when she looked down in shock. It appeared as though she was stuck to her leg and it was on the ground as she pulled it in the opposite direction. Her only success, despite pulling even harder, was tripping and falling against a nearby wall, where her hand automatically grabbed onto another purple ball, leaving it hopelessly stuck once more. She was now hunched over, one hand outstretched against the wall of the alleyway, one leg unsteady on the ground. It was not comfortable, it was even scarier. Fear paralyzed her. "I wouldn't recommend squirming too much," said a nasally awkward voice behind her, "and I definitely wouldn't recommend making any noise, unless you want to know how my balls feel pulling your lips together. Listen, honey, we're not that different. We both want the same thing. You wanted that cat, right? Well, I don't know how fluent you are in English, but there's a word that means cat that starts with P. It has another meaning too, but if you think about it, that's what we both want here, right? Besides, I heard you talking with your friends. Don't pretend that if I weren't some handsome Adonis, you wouldn't want this." She felt her hands on her skirt's edge. "Hey, are you the one they call Mango Kumquat?" The potential attacker and victim both gazed at the intruder in disbelief. He was either a villain who truly embraced the moniker and went full comic book about it, or a pro-hero who really went overboard on the intimidate villains part and totally ignored the inspire hope part, as evidenced by his ridiculously spiky blonde hair and a jumbled costume. In any case, the girl was relieved that someone was stepping in. "The media called me Date Grape, thank you very much, not that dates are part of my theme at all, but whatever, and if you don't mind I was in the middle of something." He said, "I do mind," which gave her hope, but when he went on, "You've been recommended to me as a henchman, and I don't want to wait," it all fell apart. "Henchman? Why would I want to work for you?" The intruder replied, "'Cause I'm gonna be the strongest villain in Japan one day, and you'll have the opportunity to bask in my glory," which irritated Date Grape a little. He turned back on his victim and licked his lips, saying, "Pass. I don't really do this for the higher ideals, or even the power and money. I do this for the ladies." The apparent new recruit completely disgusted Poison Dart Frog. The fact that they had placed her on the same list as him also caused her some distress. She liked to think she had some standards, but she had no illusions about the course she had followed in life. She would prefer not to watch, even though she admitted that she would like to see a lot happen to that girl just because she reminded her of one of those bitches from high school. Although for presumably different reasons, she didn't seem to approve any more than Lord Explosion Murder. She had to suppress a snicker at that name. Power and money is how most men get laid, loser. He yelled. You're going about this the wrong way. For what it was worth, this, date grape, figure did briefly display some embarrassment before scowling and hardening his face. Some handsome Chad like you wouldn't know what it's like. Now, are we done here, or are you going to waste both of our times trying to stop me? Lord Explosion decided to only reply to the first comment, for whatever reason. Yeah, I don't know what it's like, because I'm not some loser who thinks letting himself be a loser is the right way to go about it. You've got to man up if you're going to be my henchman. I don't want to be your henchman, freak. What did you call me, you damn henchman? Poison Dart Frog let out a sigh. Even at the title, she felt a little disgusted. If you're trying to improve him, you're going about it the wrong way, sir, she said. It's not just about the sex. He resents women, and wants to hurt them. He paused as she appeared, saying, hey, that's not true, I just hate the Stacys. That date grape didn't try to cover his gaze in the slightest. He wouldn't, she assumed. Is that how all of your henchwomen look? Because if so, maybe we could come to an arrangement. He retorted, my faithful servants are not for sale. It was also convenient for him because she had a lot more space to move around and was going to force him to chase her down again if he even gave it any thought. I just wanna look. Give me that, and let me handle any attractive female prisoners you get your hands on, and sure, I'll see what working in a group feels like. Explosion Murder, Lord, shrugged. Fine with me, let's get moving. I have some other henchmen to meet. What about me? The girl complained, still confined by date grape's balls in an awkward position. Won't you save me, handsome stranger? I'd be a much better girlfriend than that freak. Remembering her school bullies all too well, Poison Dart Frog interrupted, saying, okay, let him do whatever he wants to her. At that point, the boy who blew him up and the girl who escaped him were finally located by the pro-hero Kraken, who had barely recovered from his wounds enough to pose a threat again. The potential victim let out a scream. The antagonists attempted to flee. This time, however, he was too prepared and well-trained for their tricks, and he used his tentacles to strike out and create a web to obstruct their escape routes while maintaining his center mass so that it could avoid any blasts that Lord Explosion Murder sent out. If his web of tentacles hadn't found itself adhering to several purple balls, that would have happened anyhow. He was unable to move them. He had to learn the hard way when Lord Explosion Murder and Poison Dart Frog made their getaway with a small boy who was crying because he couldn't enjoy his treat, whatever that meant. The problem with preparing for one pair of villains, tricks, was that occasionally that pair turned into a trio. It wasn't a complete loss because it appeared that he could protect the civilian girl from more harm now that they were gone. So it wouldn't be after he got himself unsticked, anyway. The security officers responded to the adolescent girl's cries with remarkable effectiveness. One questioned, what's wrong? As his companion gaped at the exhibits in the museum. There's a ghost. I think I cursed us, sorry. I just brushed against the mummy thing over there, and, he was rolling his eyes and trying to think of the best way to comfort the paranoid girl when he finally realized what had made his partner so slack-jawed that he felt compelled to reciprocate. Every exhibit in the museum was floating. He briefly questioned whether the girl had truly cursed them, but he quickly chastised himself for having such a ridiculous thought when it was clearly just a quirk. As his partner ran to do just that, he turned back to the sobbing girl and put his hands on his hips in what he hoped was a firm but non-threatening gesture. We have a potential villain attack. Alert the police and nearest available hero agency. Now, please, tell me if you saw anything suspicious. I'm sorry, I'm just so scared. She was his daughter's age, he realized. Okay, there was no point in dragging this out. Here, let me escort you out so you can get somewhere safe, okay? With a nod, she followed him to the exit until they reached the detectors, at which point she slapped her forehead in self-reprimand. Oh no, I forgot to pay for this, she said, pointing to a cheap trinket that was on sale in the gift shop. I have the money, I just really don't want to go back there. He submitted the codes to allow her entry after the detectors confirmed that she was carrying a stolen item. I understand, girlie, I'll just disable the alarms as soon as they sound. Don't worry about paying anything, we can afford to lose one of those every now and then. They're going crazy over such a pointless trinket, geesh. After they were both outside, Uraraka thanked the security guard and told him she would be okay walking home alone now that she was out of the scary place. She tried to pay for the inexpensive memento despite his insistence that she not, and then she smiled and left, feeling grateful once more that the gods had blessed her with the help of such a good man. She would never admit it aloud, but she was far more appreciative that they had given her such a foolish man. She calculated at least enough money to keep her afloat for months, then let her fingers run over the rare diamond she had pocketed before warning the guards of her own ploy. If they truly allow her to pay for them, her parents as well. She didn't have to tell them the whole truth about where this money came from, but they never really approved of her ill-gotten gains, and her father in particular was always overcome with guilt over the fact that his mistakes had put her on this path. Furthermore, although it was true that she had been put on this path by her family's financial circumstances, she had actually grown to enjoy it. She was able to fool the guards by utilizing her quirk and her innocent, unassuming appearance, coming up with inventive ways to get past the alarms, tricking those around her, and occasionally, like in this instance, getting the very people who were meant to be protecting her targets to assist her. Everything was so exciting. Even though money started it, she was able to stay in the game because of the lessons she learned along the way. She kept her escape plan ready as she moved in on her regular fence because one of those lessons was to never trust someone until you were sure they had more to lose by lying to you than by being honest. She wasted no time at all running when it became clear that a strange, spiked-haired teen was waiting for her in place of her usual guy. "Hey, power loader, I know it's a bit too hot to sell right now, but I need an appraisal on a recent haul," she said. The boy yelled, "Why do you bastards keep doing that?" and then pursued her. Before a girl she hadn't previously noticed lashed out with an excessively long tongue, Uraraka believed she was doing a respectable job of avoiding him. Uraraka was then forced to use her quirk on herself in order to avoid them. Before she was grabbed, she forced down the nausea she felt as she was lifted off the ground and didn't even bother to taunt him. Another lesson she had learned was that such childish things only hindered a real thief. She believed she had just enough control to avoid any lashings the frog girl thing could give, even as her body lifted itself up and narrowly avoided a strange purple ball. However, a boy with purple hair, damn it, another threat she hadn't noticed. Why was she slipping so much today? Leapt onto the purple ball and bounced up. He had the chance to leap onto her leg and seize it as he rolled over to avoid another blow from the frog tongue. He weighed her down and made an indiscernible up and down motion against her leg, which pulled her toward the ground and, consequently, the two threats down there, even though he was small enough that she believed she could overpower him. She found herself completely stuck after the boy, in a desperate attempt to kick out toward a nearby wall, stuck one of the balls growing from his head onto the wall, causing her foot to slam straight into it. There was no longer any chance of avoiding being tied up or avoiding the next tongue lashing. She believed she was aware that she should watch the situation, assess the scene in advance, and record any issues before she became stuck, but she hadn't done any of that today. Hell, the path she had planned to take in case she needed to make a fast escape only put her in more danger. If she wanted to provide for her family, she would have to put in more effort to become a better burglar. Of course, that was assuming she survived this ordeal. By saying, "Okay, floaty," Lord Explosion Murder confronted his most recent prospective recruit. "You're supposedly a really good thief, and the group I'm with thinks you'd make a worthwhile henchman." "So?" Poison Dart Frog interrupted, saying, "Please don't start on how she'll get the amazing opportunity to bask in your glory. Interrupt again and I'll kill you." With his mouth practically watering, Date Grape said, "Guys, if she doesn't join, then can I have her?" Finally, after a moment of disgust, this, Uravity, raised its voice. "So, this is all about a job. Yeah, I guess. I don't hurt kids and I don't initiate violence. I will provide support if you want to rough some people up, but it'll cost extra. Most importantly, I don't come cheap." The hands of Lord Explosion Murder shook. "You'll be part of the most important growing movement. Yeah, I don't really care, I just do this for the money." He had had enough of these dumb henchmen not knowing what it meant to be his extras. Bakugo had embarked on this journey after witnessing the power of true power as a child and seeing All Might. People were afraid of that man. He painted the police as cowards, pro-heroes as weaklings, and the average person as a herd of sheep to be beaten and sheared at the whim of the powerful. He had provided a role model for Bakugo, a young man with a remarkable eccentricity and an innate propensity for strength and brilliance. He had seen someone better than himself for the first time, and he was not going to waste the lessons he had learned from watching All Might tear apart a building and then speed through to make sure there were no survivors, placing hero after hero in their place. That was going to be surpassed by Katsuki Bakugo. Although Katsuki Bakugo was naturally exceptional, he now understood that he would need to put in more effort to reach truly extraordinary levels. But now here he was, collecting a group of losers who did this for pitiful loser goals while playing errand boy for All Might's greatest sycophant. Resentment for being a freak. Resentment over not being laid. Cash. Did these three failures dare to despise him as much as they had, with such pitiful ambitions and goals? You want me to pay? Floaty answered, if you want me to work for you, then of course, overlooking Lord Explosion Murder's change in tone entirely. How about I pay with your life? If that's not enough, then maybe I can pay by teaching you to be a little less of a pathetic waste of a villain who gets caught by the simplest tricks after being sold out by her own fence. And if that's not enough, well, you're not worth any more. Why don't you die? Until she had a chance to get away, Uraraka realized that she truly had no other option. Even so, she was merely reminding herself of how completely she had failed to adhere to the lessons she had already learned on the street. He was most likely superior to her at this if his goons had apprehended her and he had gained their respect. This implied that there was likely something to discover. Deal. I really do want you to teach me. I have a lot to learn if I want to keep bread on the table, and maybe you are good enough to teach me. A few inches away from her face, the boy's hand held itself. She decided that he had not threatened her in vain and that she might have just saved her own life after noticing the sparks coming from it and smelling the aroma of caramel, which she knew could be as strong as the actual candy. I do have one more demand though, she added. What? Exclaimed the boy. Could one of you three get me down? It was another day before the pro-hero Kraken could track down the villains he had been chasing after spending the entire night freeing himself from those foolish balls. He was fairly certain that he saw one of them running away as he entered a dubious-looking building. He checked the floor for sticky purple balls, but he missed all the floating furniture until it stopped floating and crashed onto his form. Lord Explosion Murder sparked his hands and got ready to beat the next guy into submission because he wasn't in the mood to deal with the hesitation of another 2-bit henchman. It wasn't too hard to find him. Bakugo cracked his knuckles and triggered 2 explosions as a warning shot while he was in his presence without even bothering to speak. He glared at this Red Riot imitator, saying, try to run away, and see what will happen. The boy just gazed in wonder at him. The imitator approached him and said, so, manly. Are you looking for any henchmen? You're amazing. He was regarded with a similar level of wonder by Lord Explosion Murder. You're not going to try and run away, are you? Or start talking about how your silly motives don't match up? Hell no. You are awesome. I want the chance to work with someone as impressive as you. After allowing himself to be stunned for a full minute, Lord Explosion put on a huge smile. Finally, one of you damn henchmen gets it. He was about to welcome the obviously principled and smart boy to the team when he was struck by a familiar tentacle, which the boy deflected by turning his arm into stone. The pro-hero let out a cry of agony, which allowed Lord Explosion Murder the chance to detonate multiple explosions surrounding Kraken's torso and escape once more. Kraken sulked and turned to leave, saying, yeah, I should just go back to helping the Coast Guard. Someone else can deal with these ones. Izuku's mind was hazy and undefined. After seeing himself battle the Nomu, what was that about? He reasoned that perhaps someone had gotten him away from it. He was unable to think clearly after that, and by all rights, he should have been unconscious like a light. However, he continued to see that he was in a well-lit room, hear what sounded like people yelling and grabbing him, and feel as though his entire body was being torn apart. Even after a day of intense competition, it was the most agonizing thing he had ever gone through, but it stopped. Everything came to a halt. Now that his senses were functioning at full capacity and his brain was being inundated with information, Izuku was in excruciating pain. A sickly-looking young man in a suit and an ornamental plague mask said, great, you're alive, without seeming to care all that much. Hold on, decorative plague mask. Your overhaul, the up-and-coming sidekick. All the charts are waiting for you go independent because they think you're going to rank up so quickly. Overhaul shouted to someone out of Izuku's line of sight, utterly ignoring the boy. Do you have any others? Ua can only call in so many favors and I hate hospitals. So many sick people, he said. Izuku told him, you saved me, anyhow. Don't get used to it. This was a one-time thing, and be grateful for it. My quirk can only heal you by ripping you apart and putting you back together. It's entirely possible for me to fail, and the results can get messy. Izuku was well aware of Overhaul's success rate in healing, and he had a strong suspicion that the man was merely attempting to intimidate Izuku into never asking for it again by refusing to do so when it wasn't absolutely necessary. On some level, he could respect that. You work with UA, Overhaul let out a sigh. If you must know, I graduated from here last year and some men I owe a lot of gratitude to called in a debt to let them go crazy with the test this year but not worry about students actually dying. It's the last time. Now, please shut up so I can move on to more important matters. The sidekick got up and left without saying anything else, leaving Izuku, who was now fully recovered, to think about his predicament. It took a little while for him to be able to stand up because it took his mind longer than it should have to process that his body was in good condition again. In the long run, it might have been advantageous because it allowed Vice Principal Jiren to visit and talk to him. Hey kid, everything turned out alright. Yeah, it seems like Overhaul healed me without any problems. He's a true hero. Jiren moaned. He's an ass. A competent one, but an ass nonetheless. Besides, what I meant was, how do you think you did on the exam? Izuku Shigaraki had to bow his head in shame after he recovered from his momentary shock at hearing a member of the school staff curse in front of a potential student. He searched his mind for positive remarks about his performance. I only killed one Nomu by myself. I don't think I got the points to pass. Jiren gave his chin a rub. That would be awful, if that was all that mattered. I'll be reviewing the footage myself later. You might be surprised what turns up. Izuku didn't know if it was better to hold on to that fleeting hope or to be realistic enough to avoid disappointment. Still, I don't know whether or not you'll have points docked for the stupidity of trying to do that quirkless. Our intel says that you have the right joints for developing a quirk. Have you not figured it out yet, or are the stories true, that your father took yours away so you couldn't be a hero? The boy began to stutter as he expressed his shock at the charge. Even though he had been overly protective for the majority of his life, All for One wouldn't take away his own son's peculiarity by force. Those who wished to abolish it, the genuinely malevolent criminals who had it removed as a form of punishment, and a general warning for exceptionally awful circumstances where the greater good necessitated actions that would not typically be taken. Izuku was only permitted to use his quirk in those three circumstances. He was never able to test out the middle one because of his father's enduring overprotectiveness. Since only those with severe drawbacks were willing to give up their quirks in this day and age, Izuku had never seen much opportunity there. Fortunately, he had never encountered a circumstance in which taking a quirk away from a good person was deemed a necessary evil. He didn't even believe that he could take it by force. Garaki's analysis from his childhood, which was the only proof that he most likely possessed All for One's quirk, suggested that his version was more difficult to activate and slower. He might have tried it against Mountain and Kamui, but it would likely not work unless the person he was taking from was, under his power, no absorbing in the middle of a fierce battle. Jiren nodded in agreement with his explanation, which was exactly the same as what the reader had just read, save for about 3 times as much mumbling, digressions about different theoretical ethics essays, and one speech about the connection between theoretical data and actual results. Eventually, he sighed and cut the boy off. You know that you're going to be at a disadvantage, right? Even if you managed to absorb a quirk between now and the start of class, you'd still be using it alongside people who've known and trained with their quirks for their entire lives. I know that I have to work hard, but I will be hero. Jiren shoved his face directly into Izuku's personal space and said, convince me. You have a quirk that you're afraid to use. By your own admission, you didn't go a great job at the exam. Why should I let you into this school? What, besides flowery words about hard work and not giving up that I could get from a public school's wall posters, can you demonstrate to me that would make me think you'd be a good fit? Although Jiren was aware that he was being dramatic, he truly did not want to fail this child simply because he was All for One's son. He was even less motivated to fail All for One's son. Please don't force me to steal a girl's thunder for you, child. Show me anything at all so that I can later claim that I gave you permission to enter. They both turned to see the blue-haired boy from the entrance exams tapping his fingers on the doorway. I can demonstrate that, he said. The other 2 men weren't paying much attention, but if one did, he was running them up and down to make sure none of the 5 were ever touching it at the same time. It was his idea for me to rot the ground beneath the Nomu and trap it. As embarrassing as it is to admit in hindsight, I never would have thought of it, though it gave me a lot of ideas about how I can fight future villains. And the girl that actually took out the thing only did so by following what he noticed. This boy put a shocking amount of express into it for a non-spellcaster build, and quite frankly I want to spend my time here in UA with one of my few intellectual equals. Jiren was satisfied with that. It probably wouldn't have been for many students, but it would have worked perfectly for the one student he needed an excuse not to reject. Stain's problem was that the boy would likely still require assistance in passing his entrance exam. Izuku said to the eerie boy, "Thanks for that," as they both walked out of the school's medical facility. The boy shrugged. It was true. Everyone else lost their heads when that thing showed up. Everyone except us. It would have been wrong for one of those screaming cowards to get in when you didn't. Izuku nodded, deciding that merely imagining him as the creepy boy was no longer enough, and at last extended his hand. Izuku Shigaraki. Tenko Shimura, the boy casually replied with his own courteous gesture, but then his mouth froze and he began to think. Shigaraki. Izuku let out a sigh. Yes, the son of all for one himself. Would something like an autograph request be made? A tirade about one of his most notorious, for the greater good, choices ever. A barrage of intrusive inquiries concerning his celebrity status. Your father saved my life once. Considering how many lives all for one had actually saved, that was a surprisingly uncommon statement for Izuku to receive. Such people, he assumed, were not likely to be sycophants. It's kind of stupid, but he's the one who made me want to become a hero. Izuku grinned. Honestly, it was the same for me, though don't tell him I said that. He worries too much. Shimura sneered, worries about threats to the #1 hero's son. Izuku replied, well, you know how dads are, but his new friend's face darkened. No, I don't, actually, exclaimed after taking a deep breath, my father, well, let's not ruin this day with talks about sad things. From the look on that man's face, you got in, and I know I did well enough to pass, so we'll be in this school together. Huh, I guess I rolled better for charisma than I thought. A week later, discs were distributed outlining who was allowed entry and who would have to search elsewhere for hero prospects in the future. Izuku remained uncertain despite Shimura's statements until the floating hologram of Compress's face told him that, despite being close to the bottom in villain defeat points, he had received consideration for outstanding performance in other areas, to just about make it into the lowest passing slot. He spent a few minutes shouting in unbridled joy before looking at the rankings to see who his classmates would be. Both Tenko Shimura and the attractive girl who had been staring at him had succeeded. In addition to her reasonably impressive number of villain takedowns, she also earned some rescue points for saving him. Thanks to both rescue points and assistant points, that lizard boy Shimura had been using as bait also managed to get in by participating in the scheme that allowed Tenko to eliminate so many. Hold on, why did theirs list reasons other than villain takedown for entry? Izuku looked over the list and discovered that, yes, everyone, aside from him, who had a further factor in their villain takedown number that led them into UA had a publicly available explanation. The ambiguous consideration for outstanding performance in other areas note had just been given to him. What was meant by that? Well, it meant what he discussed with Jiren, but why was that so ambiguous? My father is the reason they're letting me in. He was aware of it. He was certain that everyone who took the time to look up who was ranked where and saw his last name was aware of it. Izuku Shigaraki was traveling down the path of his dreams, but he detested the fact that it was the Shigaraki, not the Izuku, that had brought him there. Aguchi prayed and pleaded in silence to whatever gods might be listening and know that he was near. He couldn't actually enter the school because he couldn't have removed a sizable portion of Nomus on his own, of course, but his parents couldn't really be critical of him if he had only just failed, could they? He appeared anxious as they watched him set the holographic disc to play. They appeared to be passing judgment. When his mother embraced him and expressed her pride, Shigaichi was completely taken aback because he had bowed his head in shame and had not really listened to the condolence letter they had prepared for the failures. He had been waiting to analyze the words for his ranking and try to defend himself. It took a ridiculously long time to realize that Mr. Compress was dead, and they were confused, looking more closely at his hologram to see what might have caused this. He was accepted by UA. This was dreadful. It's not quite as bad as being expelled from the house for not even attempting to succeed, but it's a close second. He would now have to live up to the expectations of his family. He was unable to adapt to neat life without making them even more irate. It might not be so horrible. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could demonstrate that he wasn't a failure and that he was capable of achieving something in life. No, that was ridiculous. Shigaichi Iguchi simply had to accept that, by some strange twist of fate, he was forced to work tirelessly for a future for which he was unfit and move on. Not even deliberately trying to cover her teeth to keep her parents from freaking out could make Himiko Toga less happy when she heard the news. She would become a pro-hero. The use of her quirk was going to be authorized. She would be able to be herself without turning into a monster. If her parents had been equally as thrilled about their daughter leaving the house for extended periods of time as they were about her determining her future, it would have been a little more pleasant, but that was the reality. She pondered whether she would be assigned to Mr. Staney's class. Up until now, he had been a good teacher, but she was concerned about claims of partiality. However, she also thought that Izuku Shigaraki, kid, who had barely made it in for some absurd reason, would obviously take the heat off of her in that particular area. Hey, wasn't that the same boy she had awkwardly gazed at on exam day? He hadn't been bothered by her gaze, and his blood had been so lovely. To be fair, he probably had no idea why she was looking at it, but it was a pleasant thought anyhow, especially when she later tasted his blood and discovered that it was as good for the palate as it was for the eyes. In her limited experience, most blood did, but this boy's seemed especially wonderful. She blushed as she considered whether this was the typical feeling of a crush. A stupid one, to be sure, since she didn't know anything about him and didn't even think he was attractive. He wasn't ugly, just plain, but based on her recollection, that didn't really set her apart from the majority of the girls at her previous school and their romantic relationships. In any case, it was a ridiculous diversion from a much more significant line of thought, which was how she would get ready for UA and utilize its resources. When Jiren saw how he compared to his peers, he couldn't help but feel a little proud, even though he knew it was a pointless ceremony designed to control his emotions and make him forget what a bureaucratic mess a power-hungry and controlling state had forced upon him. He wasn't going to turn down even a government board that acknowledged his amazing quirk and use of it. He felt that this meant his years spent simply honing his quirk, ignoring all other duties that weren't important for securing his future, like school work, to ensure he had the grades and not because they actually taught him anything worthwhile, or promoting the Meta Liberation Party's cause, but naturally, looking at the other people who made it and reminded him of the truth behind the pomp and circumstance. Shigaraki, of course the guy at the top must have the system work for him. Until a more rational political era arrived and he could do so without the red tape of parliament, he would be able to continue using his quirk and become a pro-hero. He would be on par with Destro and others. He might even outperform All for One. Regarding his feelings for the number one hero, the boy was constantly torn. On the one hand, All for One should be commended for pushing humanity to its limits because he possessed the most potent quirk of all in use. He, on the other hand, removed people's peculiarities. According to Jiren's personal philosophy, a man's value was determined by his ability to use his quirk, which included the right of every man to support and encourage his own quirk. A person's quirks were a sacred and essential aspect of who they were. Simply put, taking them away was wrong. Even though he didn't consider himself religious, there was a pseudo-spiritual aspect to his perception of quirk usage, and All for One's quirk led to a theological error. However, the ability to take away another person's quirk was itself a natural quirk. Jiren decided to make a costume instead of continuing to think about things that made him uncomfortable intellectually. From his position above the building, looking down on the entrance, Shizuo Makaguro observed. He was able to observe the student body from a distance by setting up a whole network of covertly concealed pathways around the walls and roofs, thanks to UA's resources and its somewhat bizarre philosophy on what teachers should be permitted to do in order to improve their students. Naturally, his attention was on the new class that would soon be placed under his tutelage. The time had come to determine whether they truly merited the time and effort. It wasn't so much favoritism as the special chance to pass his test before anyone else did, and he was confident Himiko Toga would make it. Given how blatantly rigged the entrance exams were, he was a little more skeptical, but not by much, that All for One's brat wouldn't. He had serious doubts, but Jiren had warned him that the boy might surprise him. He nearly hoped the boy would not impress him. All for One needed to see that he was subject to the same regulations as everyone else. Then there were the others, who were allegedly the top 40 in a group that some of his distinguished faculty members believed would pass in a typical year. He didn't have enough information to judge the accuracy of such a harsh estimate, but based on their facial expressions, none of them appeared especially impressive. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the first year that most failed. Izuku gaped as he gazed at his new classroom's doors. His future would be like this. He would become the future here. Additionally, he was determined not to make the same mistake he had made the last time. Unfortunately, he didn't realize he was going to bump into another student because he was too preoccupied with that when he entered, and it hurt a lot when he struck his head against the odd mask the student was wearing. Izuku was too preoccupied to respond, as he was massaging his aching forehead. "Watch where you're going. Wait a minute, you're all for one's son, aren't you? Yet, you're so pathetic. The scion of a vast and incredible legacy, you should be the picture of a hero. You should be the one we're all looking up to. But what are you, some awkward little shrimp, who barely passed the entrance exams? It's just wrong for someone like you to be even more pathetic than someone like me." The boy's tone of voice conveyed that he was truly offended that Shigaraki wasn't as amazing as, well, the other Shigaraki. Izuku had experienced similar emotions before, but this was the first time he had seen someone who was both aggressively certain of his hatred for the boy and acutely aware of the reasons behind it. The reasons behind Katsuki's attitude had been different. None of his other bullies considered what it was about Izuku that disturbed their perspective. This man devoted himself to the bit. Izuku's heart grew smaller. He had wished that Ua would be different, that he wouldn't be the target of taunts and no one would speak up. A man in a snowsuit yelled, "Hey, what are you two yelling about?" He asked again before they could answer, "And what the hell is with your face? Do you have some kind of mutation quirk, because that doesn't look like a strong one?" Under the mask, the sound of teeth grinding could hardly be heard if one listened closely. "My quirk affects all who breathe it, including myself. This is for my own protection." The snowsuit-clad boy chuckled. "You can't handle your own quirk. What a loser. I can't believe we're in the same class. My quirk is clearly so much better than yours." Now, through the words of the masked one could hear the ground teeth. "If you truly have a better quirk, then it is your duty to be the better person." Bullshit. Society belongs to those who've been blessed and know how to use their blessings. Weaklings just get in the way. Jiren Koryo, probably one of the only ones here who's worth a damn. The person wearing the gas mask replied, "Musatato Abe, because, despite the fact that it was impolite, an introduction was an introduction." Jiren appeared to be about to say that he didn't care, but he stopped himself in surprise as he raised a hand to silence him. "Correct me on my English. Your name is Mustard." "Musatato," he angrily corrected. "And isn't your last name basically Ice?" "Izuku Shigaraki," Izuku said, choosing to break up the impending altercation before it got out of hand. As both stared in increasing shock and confusion, he went on a surprisingly long digression on the etymology and linguistic shifts surrounding hero naming culture. And I think it's worthwhile to point out that many families in the chaos of the early days of quirks, especially those who embraced political causes or even religions centered around them, would adopt common names or even change their surnames to reference their quirks, a practice that was meant to reference. His plan worked. Eventually, Jiren cut him off by bringing up Izuku's opening statement. "Shigaraki." He squinted. Izuku now had to contend with one of his father's detractors. Another bastard who got strong by taking what others had. Another bastard who takes from people what is rightfully theirs. That was simply fantastic, and also one of the greatest quirk users in history. Oh, what conflicts I feel. Musatato had seized the chance to evade detection. Izuku considered doing the same after realizing that this conversation was not progressing well. Jiren exclaimed, "One day, you won't be able to hide behind your father's power," as he did so. The world's going to wake up and realize that Redestro is right about the future of heroes. We'll see how valuable that quirk turns out to be then. Himiko Toga observed the conversation with curiosity. She was determined not to pass up the opportunity to finally make friends who genuinely liked her rather than the facade she constantly made herself put on. Unfortunately, she didn't really know how to make friends because she had been vacillating between being friendless and making friends while wearing the mask for so long. So she just watched. Besides, she should improve at doing that, Staney had always said. Her ability to read people and situational awareness were crucial for hero work, but learning how people behaved so she could more realistically mimic them was also crucial for optimizing the usefulness of her quirk. She listened in on the boys, both objectives in mind. She frowned at what she heard. They seemed to be random jerks to the unassuming green-haired one. The boy's tone and smugness were totally off-putting, even though he dressed like an Eskimo and made some remarks about the value of quirks that she kind of agreed with. He also revealed that he was a Redestro fanboy, a hero she had always kind of secretly admired, not that she'd ever say it aloud. A proper girl didn't engage with politics, and especially not such vulgar politics. Then there was the boy who swore about something while wearing a gas mask. To be honest, she wasn't sure. As they parted ways, she decided to approach the third boy in the group about the possibility of friendship because she knew that their previous exchanges had been constructive. "Hello, I don't know if you remember, but I think your blood is beautiful." Izuku vaguely remembered that it was the girl who had saved him from that Nomu, and he remembered the girl who had picked him up off the concrete. However, what on earth had she just said? What? She hardly managed to mutter, "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfort," before stopping herself midway through, her face crestfallen. "You know what? No, I'm not sorry. What about hating blood is normal? It keeps you alive, doesn't it? Yet you can't stand to think about it. Appreciating doing what I need to do to use my quirk, now that's normal, and if that makes you uncomfortable, then..." She went on for a few more sentences in her seemingly revelatory tirade, but even though Izuku was genuinely uncomfortable and completely creeped out by her remarks, he was also suddenly captivated by the idea she presented. "You drink blood to activate your quirk. If you're the one who took down that Nomu in the entrance exams, thank you for that by the way, then that means you can shape-shift, right? Do you turn into people after you drink their blood?" "Yes," she said. "So does it work by absorbing their DNA? How did you recreate my clothes?" "I think so, that's what the doctors thought anyway, but it has to be blood. No other part of the body works with it, I've tried. As to the clothing, honestly I don't know." "Do you form into identical copies, or just become similar? Can you mold and influence the final shape? Do you just take on their appearance, or do you acquire their physical attributes as well?" Izuku's head lit up with inspiration. "Can you copy quirks?" She could tell by his expression that he was as afraid of her as everyone else. However, he began to see it after considering the limits and purposes of her quirk. This boy understood the true beauty of her gift. Staney could see it because he had a similar demand to use his quirk, but this boy only needed to swallow his disgust and consider some test-related factors that she had never given much thought to. Earlier, she had enjoyed a casual conversation with him, but now that she realized they could actually get along, she blushed. "We're friends now," she exclaimed, breaking up his one-sided game of 20 questions. "Wah, okay, sure, I don't mind that at all. I'm telling you, those mobile game designers are sharks," the same blue-haired boy from earlier interrupted, continuing the same joke. "You're going to have to buy more gems if you want it to progress past that level." "Shimura," Izuku interrupted her before she could speak. "It's not like we're just I don't know what or you say it's just." The knife was only a few seconds away from Toga's face when she sidestepped. Not so fortunate was her new best friend. His ear was nicked by the one that flew in his direction. She noticed with some pride that Shimura had avoided it by an even narrower margin than she had. Everyone else was enraged and, in some cases, screaming in agony, indicating that only that strange Musatato child had survived. "Class started 8 minutes ago, yet all of you were still talking. I presumed that meant you were too prepared for professional hero work, and let you prove it through a simple situational awareness test. All but 3 of you failed. As planned, Akagiro's exit was invisible to everyone. As he had intended, they were all frightened by his announcement and the minor injuries. He was unprepared for Toga's enthusiastic jumping, waving, and shouting, 'Hello, Mr. Staney,' in the manner of a preschooler thrilled to receive a new toy. Despite his students' enthusiasm, he found it easier than he thought to keep his cool so he could continue to project the intimidating aura he had just developed. Instead of reducing their fear of him, it appeared that many of the students were now afraid of her. That would do for him. He smiled his creepiest smile and said, 'Fortunately for you, that wasn't the test that would get you expelled if you failed it. That comes next. Someone made an attempt to bring up orientation, acclimating students to the classroom, and a number of other customs associated with the start of school. Stain advised them to quit right away to save everyone's time if they were more interested in squandering time on flimsy imagery than determining whether they truly possessed the skills necessary to be hero. His test handled the rest. The entrance exams made too few judgments and allowed too many children who weren't qualified to pass. If their hearts were sincere, it shouldn't be too hard. With the help of his reluctant ally Shin, also known as Confessor, or Seventh Precept, he set up his own room where he would interview his students. Since he was the boss's sidekick, consistent hero name branding wasn't that important, and with a quirk like his, he got a little tired of insincerity pretty quickly in life anyhow. He would inquire as to why they wished to become heroes. If he had any reason to doubt their sincerity, he would use his associate's quirk, which allowed him to pose a question and then compel the subject to provide an honest response. As one of the boss's more cherished sidekicks, the man had a lot of work assisting with police investigations and resolving hung trials, so it was fortunate that he was available. There was no use in wasting Stain's time this year if Musatato Abe hadn't improved from the previous year, so he called on him first. Stain casually questioned, "So, kid," holding a knife in front of the potential pupil, "why do you want to become a hero?" To which he replied, "Heroes are the best of the best." Stain was a little taken aback. He could tell the boy was sincere without even using Shin's quirk. He was the only one who failed. Or, if Musatato hadn't gone on, he would have. And only the best of the best have what it takes to make things better for the worst of the worst. Or, they should. "I've seen so many heroes just be so utterly worthless," the young man commented, "when they are the pinnacle of society. People who are better than me should be better. That's what I want, to be better, to uphold the values that they're supposed to, so that I can stop looking up to failures and crooks, and start looking down on them as someone who does better, by the civilians, by society, and by the name of hero. It's the only way that the world can make sense." Stain decided that his services were not needed, but Seventh Precept looked to him. Compared to the rambling tirade about heroes needing to learn how to use guns and killing all the villains he had heard the previous year, that chain of convictions was too complex and unique to the boy's way of thinking to have been something he made up because he believed Stain wanted to hear it. The boy investigated and discovered, even though his beliefs weren't the most morally righteous in the beginning, they were still guiding him in the right direction. Stain saw possibilities. "Congratulations, Musatato Abe." Even though it wasn't that cold outside, Stain didn't understand why the next boy insisted on wearing Eskimo clothing. Although he knew that this, Jiren Koryo, had an ice-related quirk, nothing in his information indicated that he would have to cope with cold when not actively using the quirk. Oh well, one could still become a hero despite such eccentricities. No, Jiren's beliefs were responsible for that duty. Because the quirk is a fundamental part of a person, possibly the most important part, and our oppressive society doesn't let us use it freely unless we get our names in the system. Being a hero is the only way to be free. Stain winced. On one level, he was grateful for the candor, but this one also revealed him to be a failure with misguided convictions. Stain stepped forward and looked down at the boy, asking, "So you want to be a hero for yourself? Not to, say, help out the little guy?" His glare had brought down many a villain. But not this child. There is no one smaller than the individual. Society exists to serve the individual, one where the society expects every individual to serve it as a nation of slaves. I intend to be a free man. Convictions are commendable. Even if the boy was simply repeating the original Destro's aphorisms, every indication Stain could point to showed that he truly believed what he was saying. Your political opinions are irrelevant, at least as far as society at large goes, but heroes require a specific philosophy. A hero is entrusted with more power over his quirk, and in turn he has to have the interests of the people in mind. If you want your name in the system, then you're going to have to convince me that you understand that. He gestured toward Shin with a nod. And don't lie. Oh, if you want to give me a lecture about why that idea about putting society before yourself is wrong, then Ua is completely uninterested in you. Jiren clenched his teeth for a few minutes before saying, "I want to make the world a better place for all people, at least those willing to take advantage of it, and being a popular pro-hero will give me the influence to do it. Maybe we disagree on what I mean when I say, better, but you just said my personal politics for society at large are irrelevant, didn't you? I am saving people, in both the old-fashioned way, and by directing society to a better, freer, future." When Stain asked the confessor why Jiren wanted to be a hero while his quirk was active, Jiren surprised him by responding with the exact same response he had just given on his own initiative. Maybe you do have potential. When Tenko Shimura stepped into the small space Stain had created, he was completely unfrightened. His instructor wished to cure him of that as soon as possible. "Why do you want to be a hero?" "Oh, you know, save lives, make a difference, earn badges for my unfinished Boy Scout troop years. It just gives a nice, tingly feeling inside, you know. Knowing that I'm doing the right thing. Akaguro had been misled by the first two into believing that the failures would at least tell intriguing lies. That was an excellent speech for the Miss Japan contest. He held a knife close to Shimura's neck and flourished it. He moved his knife closer to Shimura's neck and said, "Now, if that's your final speech, I will have my friend here force you to tell it again honestly. If it doesn't match up exactly, then someone's going to get cut." He went on. From the program, of course, after it became evident that he had actually been successful in intimidating the boy. For a few seconds, Tenko's gaze shifted back and forth between the two men, and he didn't say anything until Stain turned to demand the use of the truth quirk. "My name is Tenko Shimura. Do you know who my grandmother was?" The name, Shimura, triggered some vague factoid in Stain's mind from a long ago history class, just as he was about to dismiss the importance of surviving on family legacy. "You're the grandson of the seventh claimant to One for All." The boy gave a nod. "I'm the brat of the second worst villain in history after All Might. Growing up, that didn't make life easy, especially for my father, who didn't take the relationship with my old lady's evil very well. Apparently, I look like her, and for those who remembered her, including my parents, well, let's just say I learned a lot of hard truths about the world at a very young age. After some incidents, I ran away from home. Or rather, I wandered away from home, lost in the streets, a poor, defenseless kid. I didn't hide from the general public, in fact I demanded their aid, but no one came for me. They saw this child, terrified, alone, desperate, in clear need of someone to help, and not one of them lifted a finger." His tone faltered, "Until all for one, he found me, lifted me up, and gave me somewhere to stay until my situation could improve. Of his own volition, he set me up with a place that I could train, for any profession I wanted, but ultimately I wanted to be a hero, for two simple reasons." Two fingers were raised by Tenko Shimura. Number one was something All for One told me when I wanted to know why he had invested more into me than other people he saved. Apparently, he thought it would be an important message if the grandson of a One for All became a force for good in the world. It would send an important message about the triumph of good over evil. Number two, well, there are many kids out there, wandering the streets, alone, desperate, waiting for someone to grab their hand and let them know that everything is going to be alright. I want to be the person that grabs their hand. I want to do for them what All for One did for me. Shigaichi Iguchi froze when he asked him why he wanted to be a hero. Stain sighed as time went by without a response. The only acceptable answer is the truth. If you're thinking about how to say what I want to hear, you'll be exposed by this guy's quirk. If you don't know, then you shouldn't be here. The boy muttered, "I want to matter," and then bowed his head in shame. "Matter? What? You want fame?" "No, well, maybe, but, I'm a loser, okay. I don't do anything worthwhile, and until by some fluke I ended up here I don't think I would ever have. But, looking around here, seeing this place, it inspired me. I honestly applied here because it was so difficult that, when I of course failed, my parents wouldn't cut me off for lack of effort. But now, after seeing my results in the first exam, after hearing that maybe I could be a hero, it just made me realize that I don't just have to sit there and leech off the world wallowing in my misery. I can do something worthwhile." After all the pitiful secrets the boy had revealed, Shin verified his claims, not that Stain had any doubts. Despite his temptation to let the boy down, he was sincere. He would have a chance with Stain. The interview with Himiko Toga was as dull as he had anticipated. As he had repeatedly witnessed over the past few months, she did have some selfishness in her intentions, but in the end, her heart was in the right place. She seemed like an easy pass to him. Before Seventh Precept called them out and revealed that they truly wanted the prestige and glory, 4 children attempted to discuss virtue and duty. 3 more didn't even act as though they were interested in the job's benefits. His earlier performances may have given the impression that he was softening, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction when he ejected them. He found himself in an odd predicament after the next 4. When exposed as liars under his associate's quirk, 3 of them gave him the, "I want to do the right thing" line in tones that made it obvious they were trying to pull one over on him. The 4th tried, but became sidetracked by his desire to eat the table in front of him and went on a tirade about being able to eat anything he wanted. Their candid response, though, wasn't all that bad. they weren't interested in the attention, but rather in each other, or their close companions. It seemed that Yu Hojo, Toya Setsuno, and Sorimitsu Tabe had known each other for a very long time. They wanted to do this in order to strengthen their bond since they had grown closer and more devoted to one another during that time. Stain disliked this codependency, nor of this unintentional self-centeredness. Heroes fought for society as a whole, not for the individuals they knew. Such devotion, though, might result in conviction. He would overlook it for the time being. But Suda Mamoru was a mystery. He wasn't trying to improve himself, but he used to run with a bad crowd. No, he was the sole survivor after his friends encountered the anti-drug vigilante Fat Gum. In order to defend his friends in the future, he aspired to become stronger. There was sincere conviction once more. He didn't want to run away again after his first escape. Stain would normally approve. However, if all he intended to do was return to the kinds of friends he used to run with. He slammed a knife in front of the boy and said, "I don't want druggies and low-level crooks holding the title of pro-hero. So why should I help someone with your history do so? You want to save people the way you couldn't save your friends, right? Well, what makes me think the new friends you make won't be the exact same kind of people? I'm past that life." He stumbled while speaking. "I got into UA, didn't I? They wouldn't take me if I was an actual criminal, would they?" Stain dismissed his response, saying, "The whole point of this test is to sniff them out early. Plenty of terrible people have gone through UA's halls. True, you have no record, it seems you were just a hanger-on, but your judgment in friends tells me your judgment on the field won't be up to par." Suda retorted, "A hero should defend everyone. I want to be strong, not just because I was weak on that day, but because no one else was. Fat Gum killed my best friend, and the general public's response was to debate whether vigilantism had gone too far. The pro-heroes barely intervened. Why? Because the victim messed around with drugs and had a few petty thefts to his name. So, he doesn't get justice then. I want to be the type of hero that would fight for everyone." "Is it true?" Shin Nemoto asked the boy. It was confirmed by his peculiarity. For Stain, that was sufficient. And lastly, the boy whom Stain was most and least eager to question. Shigaraki Izuku, the #1 hero himself, is a privileged child who only got here because of his last name. Even though it helped him pass the entrance exams, this child had another surprise in store if he believed that his family's history would keep him in the hero course on its own. The boy came in, sat down, and gave Stain a clumsy look as if he was trying to recall something. His eyes widened in astonishment as he turned to face Shin. "Seventh precept, or do you go by confessor now?" Before Shin could answer, Izuku continued, "The leading investigation specialist hero, one of the boss's top sidekicks, and originator of the court position, neutral witness tester. You've single-handedly exposed many corrupt organizations and saved several innocents from prosecution. Akagiro, we aren't here to discuss Shin's career, cut in." He slammed a knife into the table in front of Izuku and said, "We're here to discuss yours. Specifically, if you're even worthy of having one." Izuku felt frightened. He should be, Stain thought. "You're Stain, the killer hero." Shigaraki's expression then changed as he glanced from the knife to Akagiro once, twice, and then again. The reminder of his nickname caused Stain to grimace. So what if he was number 3 on the list of heroes ranked according to how frequently they selected that option? Society knew that some villains needed to be put down. What if, unlike All for One and Muscular, he lacked the charisma and clout to get people to overlook that? "I only kill those who deserve it. Now, tell me, why do you want to be a hero?" Suppressing the fear that still filled his face, the boy nodded. "Do you remember All Might? Kid, I started this gig when All Might was new. Yes, I remember that bastard. I watched videos of his greatest crimes as a child, over and over again. I saw how terrified everyone was. When he shouted, 'I am here,' everyone lost hope. He made them crumple over. Even pro-heroes who should have at least been able to get some civilians out or minimize the damage were utterly cowed into submission by his mere presence. I want to make sure that no one has to feel that way again. I want to be able to say, 'I am here,' and give people hope rather than destroy it. That's what a hero should do, and that's why I want to be a hero." Stain was taken aback. This boy, the last of his students he thought would be valuable, had only demonstrated understanding and conviction. It was his whole face, not just what he was saying. This was a desire that filled his entire being. When Shin used his quirk to ask him the same question, Akaguro hardly paid attention because he was certain the boy had the convictions of a hero. All of the kids were eager to learn about heroism, what it meant to be a hero, how to be a hero, how to fight, how to save lives, and apparently how to perform complex math. When they discovered that the majority of UA's course materials were actually the same as those of a typical high school, their enthusiasm soon faded. They were all so bored with Mr. Compress's attempts to make geometry interesting and enjoyable that he startled them all by going on to the next subject. Before a black mass materialized in the middle of the room, nobody was more thrilled about the prospect than studying more math. And now that we've thoroughly dug into the proofs for the dimensions of a triangle, how about we start a little introductory philosophy? Unfortunately, philosophy is a topic that is often reserved for the university system rather than high school, but UA does allow us to delve into introductory ethics. Particularly, the ethics of dealing with villains, Mr. Compress added, seemingly unaffected by the swirling form. When the mass finally transformed into something that vaguely resembled a man, albeit a man who appeared to be composed of flaming shadows, people were only half paying attention, which was, admittedly, still better than where most of them were in math class. This is Kurogiri. Izuku cut him off. Hello, young Shigaraki, rejoined Kurogiri. It is nice to see you again as well, but you really should pay attention to your teacher. The way Mr. Compress crossed his arms suggested that he shared the Shadow Man's opinion. It took a minute or two before their teacher was able to continue, awkwardly flitting between apologizing and remembering that he was supposed to be silent. This man, as those of you who've studied the history of heroes and villains should be aware, was once a criminal, and a particularly nasty one at that. He, Eraserhead, and Death Mike once formed a gang known as the Terrible Trio, and yes, the current group operating under their name was inspired by them. Rabble-rousers and hero-killers, they committed all sorts of horrific acts under the guise of improving a broken society, though they never actually specified what was wrong with it nor what their actions were supposed to be improving. Death, pain, suffering, all of it came at the hands of this man and his closest friends. Compress's speech was met with no response from Kurogiri. There was neither annoyance at being charged with a crime nor grief when people talked about the atrocities he had once assisted in. One day, after being captured by the heroes, he was operated on by the popular yet controversial Dr. Garaki, with the aid of All for One. He is now a hero, but he did not become one through genuine remorse or any attempt to better himself of his own free will. He was brainwashed. His personality was forcibly changed to make him a better person. Large portions of society are outraged by his existence. If I recall, Destro once demanded All for One be stripped of his hero license for it. For what it's worth, the two have never done it again. But I do ask you children, to start thinking of what it means to fight a villain. What it means to deliver justice. Was it justice, what was done to this man? Was it right? If not, what should be done? The majority of the class was too awkward to speak. Most of them were not like Jiren. Hello, no, it wasn't right. There is nothing more important than a man's right to be himself. This is a violation of his liberty. Mr. Compress answered, an interesting position, Mr. Koryo, does anyone disagree? Kurogiri said nothing further. Looking around the class, it was clear that a number of people did want to say something different, but it was just so awkward to argue about the value of someone's entire life when that person was right there. He flourished his cane and turned directly to Jiren, saying, if no one wishes to speak, then in the interest of encouraging robust debate and proper intellectual curiosity, I will offer an alternative perspective. Besides undergoing this psychological reorganization, his other options upon being caught were to go to jail for his crimes or maybe even face death row. Would that allow him more freedom? Jiren raised his hand to reply, but his words were sucked out of his throat. Toga spoke up when it became apparent that the boy would not respond. He'd be himself. Even in prison, he'd have control over his own mind. As he is now, he doesn't even have that. Under his mask, Compress was smiling, and they could see it somehow. Ah, I see we have two naysayers to Kurogiri's treatment, and, if no one else wishes to speak up, he said, pausing briefly, as if to give the rest of the class the signal to do so, before continuing, may I ask you to if, theoretically, you could erase Kurogiri's brainwashing right this instant, freeing him from what you're claiming to be wrong. Knowing that under his own free will he'd revert straight to being a murderous thug, would you do it? Suddenly, the two appeared even more uneasy than the other students. The words, I wouldn't, Musatato said. He chose to be a monster, and he was treated like a monster. Now he can be good for something. Suda Mamoru interrupted Mr. Compress as he appeared to be about to answer, asking, "Are you saying criminals don't have rights? Long-term, unrepentant criminals? No, they shouldn't. People need to accept what they are, and if they can't be better they shouldn't expect to be treated better." People change. Suda asked Shugaichi, "Do they?" "Well, yes, but do they change on their own, or because people make them? When someone inspires you to do better, aren't they messing with your brain on some level, changing who you are? And aren't you better off for it?" Jiren's speaking voice returned. "Are you calling this redemption? Redemption is hard. This way is much easier." "It shouldn't be easy," said Yu Hojo. "Redemption is meaningful because it's hard. Besides, he had friends and family. Does he still care about them?" Izuku tried to listen to the conversation, but his gaze was fixed on the main topic of the discussion. Kurogiri seemed indifferent to whether the students believed he should exist or not, spending the entire time just staring at them while they quarreled with one another. A few seconds later, he held up his hand. "Mr. Kurogiri." "Yes," the shadow said, and the class fell silent. "What do you think of your condition?" The whirling mass of shadows sighed and laughed, which were strange sounds coming from such an inhuman being. "That's hardly a fair question, now is it? I don't remember who I was before, not really. I know from history books that Eraserhead and Death Mike were my friends, or at least we claim to be, but if I try to think of them I barely draw the most fated thought among fated thoughts, like an afterimage of an afterimage. Something that you experienced in your early childhood, from before you had proper memories. They mean nothing to me. My old life means nothing to me. Other people sound sad when they hear it, but I don't think I even can feel sad about it. Of course, to many, that just makes it sadder. I can't answer your question, young Shigaraki, because I don't have the ability to see it as anything less than a good thing." Izuku gave a nod. "It should never be done again," said the kid, "but it wasn't wrong to have tried it." This further broadened the discussion. In the end, only Izuku, Musatato, and Shugaichi were able to state unequivocally that what had happened to Kurogiri was correct, though Izuku did so with qualifications. As opposed to it as they had been from the beginning, Jiren and Toga appeared to become even more into the "this was a crime" camp after hearing the man's speech. Suda wasn't really that sure. He had simply disapproved of Musatato's logic before, but after giving it some more thought, he changed his mind. The only person who remained silent during the debate was Tenko Shimura, who finally raised his voice at the conclusion and asked, "Mr. Kurogiri, do you hate anything?" "I hate a few things, I suppose. Do you hate the things you hated when you were yourself? Or do you only hate what Garaki and All for One tell you to hate?" Shimura asked after he failed to provide further details. Kurogiri's eyes were his only facial feature, which is why it was so amazing that they could still tell by their movements that his face was twisted in thought. He eventually replied, "I don't hate what they didn't want me to hate. Since the initial procedure, I can hate what I learned to hate on my own." Tenko appeared to be satisfied. "Ah, so not a downgrade to NPC after all, just hitting reset on the character creator. I'm okay with this." Before this was able to start another debate, Mr. Compress hit the ground with his cane. "There was a reason I brought this topic up today, besides its fascinating potential and the fact that villain rights are something you'll have to think a lot about in any hero career. You kids have Stain for hero training, and he is no softie. You will frequently be working with Kurogiri here, possibly to save your life if you screw up at the wrong time and his portals have to keep you from offing yourself. If you have a fundamental problem with him on a core level, now is the time to air out your feelings before they get in the way." Even though that class discussion had been fascinating, there was still more talking and lecturing. When Friday afternoon arrived and they experienced for the first time what they had truly come for, combat training, it swiftly vanished from their thoughts. "Okay, pay attention," Stain shouted, a little too loudly. "Before we begin, it's about time you first got into your costumes. Our society, unfortunately, places a lot of importance on your image, so UA in turn wastes a lot of money fitting your specifications. Feel free to try them on, and think about whether this is really what you want going forward. You only get a few chances to change it." The students eagerly hurried to examine the suits as a series of metal doors opened to reveal them. With 2 syringes attached to IVs running along her arms that ran up to near her neck, Toga's outfit appeared to be a typical school uniform, but it was red to blend in with the blood she would unavoidably spill, hiding it from any civilian onlookers and hopefully enhancing her image. She had discussed this idea with Staney, allowing her to drain blood without getting involved. Like her mentor, she had initially been tempted to use her knives to obtain blood, but her quirk took some effort to operate. Not much, but more than she could realistically hope to obtain by merely nicking someone in the manner that Staney enjoyed. After giving it some thought, Musatoto made the decision to complete the look he had already been compelled to begin and went all out in a uniform from World War I. Jiren simply had more mobile and protective materials inlaid into his Eskimo suit, which he kept. It was plain and unassuming in terms of the parts that stood out, and Tenko's arms and hands were left fully bare. However, it featured the most intricate set of symbols that represented leveling up, having a lot of HP, achieving an achievement, and other things that showed one was doing well in a video game. While everyone else stared clumsily, he seemed proud of the design. Iguchi's appeared to be straight out of an old comic book. It was obviously made with the typical superhero aesthetic in mind, with no regard for functionality. Sorimitsu, Toya, and Yu all wore business suits that were simple but breathable and portable, just like the boss. Sorimitsu continued to wear the cloth mask that he always seemed to wear. Presumably, it was easy to use and successful. Following in Iguchi's footsteps, Suda wore a straightforward skin suit in a vibrant color, though his body was covered in multiple tiny slits. Izuku Shigaraki had finally asked for a perfect duplicate of a suit that his mother had made for him. It was green, striped, shielded his face without obstructing his vision, and was generally useful. However, it was impossible to ignore the fact that the head was excessively round, more like his father's cranium than Izuku's, and that it was obviously intended to make reference to All for One. Was it really necessary for the boy to remind everyone who had gotten him into this school? After they were dressed and standing outside at a nearby training field, Stain smiled at them while crouching over a building that had been purposefully destroyed. He pointed to a number of red spots on his head and chest and yelled, "Musatoto, Suda, and you'd all make great villains. You win the exercise if every hero I choose is subdued or I get killed. I am a pathetic, powerless civilian. Several horrific villains are out to get me. Luckily, a group of heroes is out here to save me as well. Touching me in one of these spots, or hitting me strongly enough to feel it, will result in my death or your victory. The heroes will get their own red spots once they've been chosen." Speaking of which, he once more glanced around. "Izuku, Toya, Iguchi, you have to get me out of harm's way and take out the red spots the villains will be putting on momentarily. Unlike the villains, you have to hit all of them in order to subdue your enemies. Oh, and I should probably note, I'm kind of a stupid civilian, panicking and prone to follow whatever distraction gets in my way." It appeared as though Toya was going to say something, but Stain spoke before him. "Anyone who noticed that it seems like the villains have it easier, well, welcome to hero work. If you want fairness, I'd recommend dropping out. Knowing that the precise time limit fell under his general, don't expect fairness, rule, they had until Okaguro began yelling for assistance to get ready, arrange their pieces, and plan. Izuku, anxious about how much he could contribute, asked his friends, "What can you guys do?" While Toya responded, "I can make objects that can fit in my hand vanish from their current location and appear in my possession." Iguchi stammered and struggled to admit his embarrassingly weak power before blurting out, "I can walk on walls." Izuku put a hand to his chin and began to consider the possibilities. "Well, we don't know what the others can do." Toya cut in, "Yu Hojo can create crystals, they cover him, making armor and letting him get harder and stuff." Iguchi became animated, "I think that Musatoto kid makes some form of toxic gas. I saw him taking out a bunch of nomus with it in the entrance exam." Izuku gave a nod, "That would match up with what he said the last time I talked to him. I also recall him mentioning that he's not immune to his own quirks' effects, which is why he wears that mask all the time." That made him pause. "Hey, Toya, do you think you could steal Musatoto's mask from him? That would make him quirkless, taking out a major part of the enemy's firepower." Toya leaned back and considered it while placing his arms behind his head. "I probably could, yeah. A bit bigger than what I've normally practiced with, so it'll take me a bit of time, but I can nab it if I can focus." Izuku gave a nod, "We still don't know what Suda can do." Iguchi cut in, "We still don't know what you can do." "Oh, well, Garaki's examination said. You know Garaki. I'm All for One's son," Izuku reminded them before going on. that I can take away someone else's quirk and absorb it into myself if they're under my power or not resisting for several minutes, and theoretically I can give that quirk to someone else. I've never actually used it though. Toya and Iguchi exchanged a look before turning back to him. Toya finally demanded, "Are you telling us that you're basically quirkless right now?" He attempted to defend himself, but Iguchi yelled in desperation, "I haven't been in a situation where it was ethical or easy to take a quirk. We now have two worthless members between the affluent, privileged child and me. I sincerely apologize, Toya." Izuku corrected the lizard boy, saying, "You aren't useless. In fact, you might be the key to our strategy. And why should we listen to your plan? What, everyone should bow down and accept All for One's brat as our leader?" said Toya. Izuku responded simply and pleadingly, "I'm just trying to help out how I can. If you guys have better plans, I'd be glad to hear them, but just let me try to throw some ideas out there, okay?" Despite his frustration at having to deal with the accusation he had been dreading since he saw Yue's admissions results. "You did come up with the idea to take that kid's mask. A little obvious in hindsight, but I wasn't thinking that way until you pointed it out." Toya hesitated for a moment before muttering, and then shrugging. "Yu is a good guy. He stood beside me in my worst days, and stopped me from making a horrible mistake. I don't want to hurt him, but more importantly for this little competition I also know that he's stronger than me in a head-to-head. If you can think of a way to beat him with what we've got, then I'm all ears." Mr. Okagiro's voice screamed the least Okagiro thing they had ever heard him scream, and Izuku had barely finished explaining what to do. "Help me, oh, help me, I need a really famous hero like All for One or Magna. Come save me, oh, this building is so shiny, it looks just like a diamond, wow. More buildings should look like diamonds. They should really move on since it took them far too long to realize that he had just revealed his location to both groups. Izuku was supposed to be their main target, so he ran ahead first. Izuku had taken some basic martial arts classes at his father's insistence, but he was only a green belt, and he was the least effective at the sneak attacks he intended for Iguchi and Toya to employ, even though none of them had overt combat quirks. Prior to the others being in position, it was most logical for their adversaries to focus on him. He made an effort to move swiftly because that wouldn't make it any easier to withstand the villain's onslaught. Izuku saw Okagiro-sensei frolicking around in some wreckage after coming upon a diamond-shaped building with Iguchi and Toya hopefully out of sight. Before Izuku could reply, he went on, "Oh, did you come to save me? To be honest, I would have preferred someone taller. I don't trust you, let's wait for a better hero." The boy swallowed his pride and said, "Sir, with all due respect, it would be best to get you out of here as quickly as possible. There are a lot of dangerous villains around. Keep in mind that this was a test. I know, and I don't want to have to rely on a weakling like you to protect me. Get someone better." The point, of course, was that he was wasting time, but Izuku was having a hard time suppressing his frustration. "I am what you have. I swear I'll be good enough, that everything will be alright, if you would just come with me." Mr. Okagiro huffed, seemingly mimicking the expression of a pampered child, "I don't want to," and then turned his head away. In case Musatato failed, Suda and Yu were prepared, their eccentricities ready to explode at any time. Although it was regrettable that they were unable to collaborate with him, the boy maintained that if they worked too closely, he would harm his own team just as much as the enemies. They should just let Mustard do his thing. If that didn't work, Yu Hojo and Suda should be able to overwhelm them based on their knowledge of the other team's capabilities. They therefore waited patiently while Musatato produced clouds of his distinctive gas. Izuku quickly covered his mouth and nose with the cloth of his costume after a peculiar odor filled his nostrils. Almost certainly on purpose, Okagiro did not try to fight at all and fell apart as soon as he inhaled it. What happened to him? His makeshift filtering technique for the quirk gas would not last long, especially since the gas approaching appeared to get thicker as it gradually became apparent. Wait, it was getting thicker, but only in one direction. He knew where it came from. Breathing as little as he could, Izuku charged towards the presumed location of the masked boy, trying to indicate to Toya which direction he should be searching in. When Musatato sensed that his gas was changing and that someone was sprinting through it in his direction, he became excited. That someone soon proved to be the child of All for One. This was even better. Either this supreme being was going to be revealed as the boy's inferior, and he could slap the boy's fictitious idolatry in his face, or the boy's entrance exams were an aberrant performance, and he was about to test his skills against someone who was genuinely deserving. He saw the boy stutter and die from his gas as he reached for the weapons he kept in his suit, a dart gun that had been aesthetically altered to resemble a pistol from World War I. I was a little let down by that. He approached Izuku's barely conscious body and began to laugh, saying, "So, you are a weakling that only got in here on your father's name. What a shame. You, the legacy of the #1 hero. My great superior, brought low after a single charge, without so much as the simplest plan of what to do against me. Toya, now," Izuku exclaimed, struggling to stay awake. For a moment, Musatoto was scanning the area for danger. Had they managed to use the gas to attack him? His head felt bare the next. He began to breathe painfully and heavily, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, not since he had learned to keep the mask on all the time to protect himself from his own peculiarity. Yu and Suda watched as Musatoto's silhouette fell away in the distance. One person said, "Well, I guess it's our turn." They both realized they weren't sure, so they asked, "Do we have any way to get through the cloud he just created?" Iguchi may not have, but they did. In particular, the capacity to lower his heart rate sufficiently to prolong his breath-holding time, or at least long enough to seize the unconscious Akaguro-sensei and accompany him on a crawl up the adjacent walls that were higher than the gas could penetrate. It served as the foundation for Izuku's strategy. They knew that the others lacked powerful ranged abilities, so if Musatoto used his quirk to block all access to a single area, Iguchi could stay above everyone and avoid both the attack and use attacks. They'd just have to hope for Suda. Izuku believed that the force created by Stain adhering to the walls would be sufficient, despite the fact that he was a fully grown unconscious man and Iguchi wasn't the strongest man in the area. Furthermore, Iguchi would experience less stress than if he engaged the others in direct combat. Iguchi gritted his teeth and pushed forward, even though he had been correct that there was less strain and that the Van der Waals force was doing most of the lifting. The effects of Musatoto's quirk began to gradually diminish as he gave into it. That meant Yu and Suda would move in right away, and Toya was so sure of it that she panicked. What should I do? Think. He nearly struck his forehead with the gas mask he had just stolen, but then he had an idea. He put it on and hurried to the thickest area of Musatoto's gas. Yu and Suda were taking care to breathe in shallow breaths. Even though Musatoto's gas was running low, they didn't want to give the other team too much time or become irresponsible and take a big gulp of what was left. They battled between the urge to hurry forward and the urge to control their breathing until Yu's replica sword disappeared, because if Musatoto was eliminated, the enemy would have an advantage in getting Stain out of there and winning the match. It served as a personal reminder of his reasons for choosing the hero life, and Toya was aware that it was one of the few items he retained from the one friend he had before that avaricious jewel thief and his encounter with Toya and Sorimitsu. Enraged that his friend would take advantage of such a weakness, Yu hurried to where he believed Toya might be and ended up coughing and choking as the remaining gas filled his lungs. As Hojo fought to stay upright, Yu was greeted by someone in Musatoto's mask without the mask and another in Toya's costume and Musatoto's mask. The latter apologized and threw back his sword. Toya begged him, "I had to show what I could do, and this was the only way I could think to beat you," but Yu was beginning to lose consciousness and collapse until the gas ran out without Musatoto keeping it going. The gas was fading, and Izuku was gradually becoming less dizzy. He could still hardly see or hear anything around him, but he saw that two men were standing around Toya. One hit him with what appeared to be a crystal arm, but he did it awkwardly and slowly. For whatever reason, the other continued to run forward, farther back from his companion. Izuku took advantage of this and ran forward, tripping over himself and colliding with Suda. This proved to be the biggest mistake of the entire ordeal, as knives appeared between the slits in Suda's costume and pierced Izuku's flesh. As the pain intensified, he thought, "Well, now I know what his quirk is." He pondered if that was permitted, and after concluding that Stain would simply refer to it as a real-world experience, as long as Suda didn't attempt to kill him, he attempted to adopt a fighting stance as he danced back, bleeding, fending off any distraction from the persistent pain and fog in his brain. This man is a close-quarters combatant. After giving that some thought, Izuku picked up a piece of debris nearby and threw it at Suda. The latter automatically folded his arms into a makeshift shield, but it only succeeded in making him scream in agony when it struck them. Then, with metal blades sprouting all over his body, Suda charged directly into Izuku's location, causing Izuku to flee. Suda appeared to be stronger overall and had the advantage of natural weapons in a straight fight, but it was clear from watching his footwork and fist movements that he had received street fighting training. He struggled to control his movements. The green-haired boy could likely get Suda into a grapple with ease if this were a typical martial arts competition, but in this instance, he would only end up getting stabbed. As he dodged Suda's next blow, his desperate thought process made him realize that the other boy had overcorrected, leaving his leg open to a trip. The villain for this exercise was quickly dispatched to the ground, and Izuku wasted no time in pursuing his red locations. He was able to hit two before Suda's blades once again rendered it impossible for him to get his arms close to the child's body. The boy then had an epiphany. He yelled, "Toya, we just have to hit the red spots." And Suda immediately remounted and headed for his own red spot. I know, Toya yelled back, annoyed that his partner was wasting time stating things he already knew and that Yu's gas sickness was the only thing protecting his spots. Even as he was preoccupied with Shigaraki's ramblings, he was reminded of this fact by his lifelong friend's rapidly growing crystal claws. Izuku kept yelling, "It doesn't matter where they are when we hit them." Toya realized something that was clear in retrospect. Just as Yu's head was beginning to clear up, he noticed that a few items of his clothes felt slightly different. To kill Toya, he would have disregarded that, but then a buzzer went off. A voice that had been recorded yelled, "Yu Hojo has been subdued." Then, bewildered, he noticed that Toya was holding all of the red spots he had kept on his suit. While he was observing, a few more emerged. "Suda Mamuro has been subdued. Toya, you do realize that this is utter bullshit, right? Hey, a win's a win." Stain had a lot to say about all of them, even though he agreed enough to acknowledge that Izuku, Toya, and Iguchi had actually prevailed. Before Toya's final trick, Musato, Yu, and Suda made several massive mistakes. Who can tell me their worst one? Nobody responded for a long time. After a while, Tenko Shimura said, "They stuck straight with the typical meta against a creative build." As he attempted to decipher Tenko's metaphor, Stain scowled. "Are you suggesting that they failed because, instead of strategizing different ways that they could have gone about this, they simply stuck to the most obvious and predictable uses of their quirks?" Tenko gave a nod. "A boring way to put it, but yes. You're mostly right. That was their second biggest mistake. Their first was banking everything on Musato's original plan without even considering a real backup. As we saw, they didn't even account for avoiding his gas themselves if it didn't work out. Abe, you're going to have to work on not taking out your allies if you want to succeed as a hero, and you and Suda, you're going to have to work on accounting for your teammates' weaknesses." He turned and nodded at Toya and Izuku. "What you did was clever. It showed that you could think outside the box and not trap yourself with preconceived rules. However, the only one I can honestly give a passing mark to on this test was Iguchi. Who can tell me why?" Iguchi was taken aback. He had been waiting for the tirade about how he had done everything wrong and let his teammates do all the work for the entire concluding speech. Was this a ruse to get him to tell a falsehood that he deserved it? He was going to reprimand their instructor for his performance when the eerie girl who always referred to him as Mr. Stainey raised her voice. "The problem with practicing with wooden swords is that it makes you forget the edge of real ones until it's too late," she yelled excitedly. When Mr. Akaguro turned to face the girl, his face was expressionless. "And can you explain that in a way that everyone else will understand?" Of course, a real villain would have wasted Izuku. "Sorry, Shigaraki, but it's true. Had Musato wanted, he could have choked you out long before you could point him out to your friend. Suda could have skewered you multiple times if he wasn't holding back because he had no interest in killing a classmate." She was beaming with delight when she said this information. And, of course, Toya's little winning maneuver only worked because of the game's rules. Real villains don't have spots to touch. Real civilian rescue operations, however, do have silly little civvies to get out of the way, which Izuku did. He's the only one whose every action was in line with a real villain fight. Based on his expression, Toya seemed to enjoy his nickname just as much as Iguchi did, that is, not at all. Stain smiled at her before turning to face the others. "I deliberately built the teams that way because you, Suda, and Musato had powerful attack quirks, while Izuku, Toya, and Iguchi all had quirks that didn't immediately lend themselves to physical damage. The stupid might call them weak quirks, and I wanted to see if they were stupid enough to think that themselves. While I suspect that reviewing the footage of your planning might show me that you did, you still ultimately planned around your supposed weakness, rather than let it control you. Everyone else should take notes. In the following round, Toga and Shimura were positioned as the heroes and Jiren and Sorimitsu as the villains. With this arrangement, Stain appeared to take a different approach. Instead of emphasizing quirks that were perceived as strong versus those that were perceived as weak, he divided the teams so that each had one direct attack quirk, Jiren and Shimura, and one indirect attack quirk, Sorimitsu and Toga. He wasn't going to maintain the same standards every time because that would imply fairness, but it held up. So, the old man is not only expecting us to take those two down, but after the lecture he gave the last students he's going to expect us to take them down the way we would a real villain. Toga gave an eye roll. Complaining about it is not going to help you at all. Oh, I'm not complaining. I'm glad someone's finally making us get good. I just want to make sure the objectives are clear to everyone. Yeah, so I'll probably be either using my knife skills or staying back and providing support. No you won't, Tenko cut to the chase. I have a far better plan for how you can use your quirk to help us. But we have to simulate a real rescue, and, well, my quirk will freak people out. Tenko began to scratch his neck, saying, people will forgive a lot when you've saved their lives, and you need to get over that anyway. My own appearance is hardly going to endear me to the crowds, anyway. It's my deeds that will get me to the top. Jiren demonstrated his skills by causing multiple ice cubes to spin through the air. So, I control ice, he said. What can you do? With hunger in his eyes, Sorimitsu responded, I can eat and digest anything quickly. If there's anything I can't, I haven't met it yet. Jiren pondered, there has to be a way we can use this. Looking at his partner, Sorimitsu yelled, I apologize. I haven't eaten in a long time, and, well, everything looks so delicious. Then have some rocks, Jiren said emphatically. Really, you're not going to look down on me. Our quirks make us what we are. They show our value as people. If your quirk lets you eat anything, then it would be a crime to starve yourself. Maybe not a crime against our corrupt and worthless laws, but a crime against yourself. The man might have sobered and embraced his fellow adolescent if he weren't too busy savoring every stray rock in front of him. Sorimitsu had only heard such words from two people previously, and now he heard it from this stranger, whom he kind of thought was a jerk before. Because it diverted his comrade's attention until he realized that being able to eat and digest anything quickly meant being able to get rid of anything quickly, Jiren began to regret what he had said, not because he thought Sorimitsu's quirk was disgusting or anything so banal. A vague notion began to take shape in his mind. It certainly got his students' attention, even though Stain disliked calling out for the help of some of the most image-hungry heroes in the world. Any minute now, they should both be able to locate him, there. He was pleasantly surprised to see Sorimitsu and Toga as the first people on the scene. On the surface, it appeared that they both had the weaker quirks, which is why lower-level students would have kept them back. His first lesson was paying off, which was good to see. With the boy exposing his teeth and the girl brandishing her syringes as weapons, the two began at each other. After a fairly long pause, they both jumped forward, but not at one another. Sorimitsu went for a nearby pillar, and Toga went for Stain. When a piece of rubble that the pillar in question had been supporting collapsed after Sorimitsu swiftly, almost instantly, chewed through its base, Stain nearly had to rely on Kurogiri to get them out of there. Fortunately, his protege was quick enough to just about get them both out of there without him having to act out of character. Stain yelled, "Thank you, kind hero." To draw Sorimitsu's attention, he was, after all, attempting to make things difficult for the heroes and to be in keeping with his persona as a grateful citizen. "You're welcome. Now, please close your eyes, this will only sting a little." Naturally, when she drank some of his blood, he screamed about the freak and demanded to know what was happening. She was obviously hurt, but he showed no mercy in his insults because she would know that he didn't mean it and that she needed to be ready for actual civilians to harm her in this way. No effort was made to conceal their location or reveal her strategy to any members of the opposing team who were aware of her peculiarity. When she changed, he only deviated from the norm to remind her that her spots still needed to be accessible. Sorimitsu's powers allowed them to create tiny tunnels anywhere, just as Jiren had hoped. It took some time to enlarge them sufficiently for human use due to his mouth's limitations, but in the end, they had a system of tunnels that allowed them to get the drop on their adversaries in a very manageable amount of time. Jiren hadn't expected much from theoretically skilled opponents anyway, but his indirect attack against the civilian hadn't gone as well as he had hoped. He could shine as a result. Using his quirk, the young political activist grabbed some stored ice cubes from the coolant he had lined into his costume and threw them into the debris where his teacher was yelling that his classmate was a freak. The ice cubes warped until they were his personal weapons, ready to find and destroy their target. Tenko waited for Toga's initial move after using his special ability to rot a few brief entrances through the debris to allow his team rapid passage. She needed to deceive their adversaries by becoming a false target, and he needed to decide how he could help. On the surface, he appeared to have a powerful and destructive quirk. While he was no slouch in ordinary martial arts, Jiren really had the better build for PvP in these circumstances. He did, however, defeat human opponents without even seriously injuring them, if the objective was to eliminate inanimate objects or kill people outright. Of course, that was presuming the boy had access to ice. Would he be able to make some for himself? As he considered it, Tenko saw that he only knew that his classmate's quirk involved manipulating ice, not all the specifics. Perhaps Tenko had an idea when he noticed a broken water vane in a boiler that was still intact in a house that was still standing, even though the surroundings weren't conducive to maintaining ice. She had always been told by Mr. Staney that if her ideals were pure, she didn't need to worry about appearance. Much more rudely, Tenko had pointed out that if she wanted to be successful in this industry, she would need to overcome her fear of what other people thought of her. Above all, she had repeatedly assured herself that she would no longer lie about who she was for the benefit of society and that she was growing more and more content with the choice every day. In order to prevent the real freaks from coming to kill them, she told the obnoxious civilian that what she was doing would save their lives and that he should close it. In response, Staney's character harumphed, but she paused her struggle long enough to absorb some of his blood and change into a different shape. She attempted to whisper, "Run in Tenko's direction, and I'll divert their attention by running in the opposite direction." Once again, rather loudly, Staney yelled in character, "Who's Tenko?" She began to describe her classmate when multiple blocks of ice crashed into them, and she gave herself an internal slap for forgetting the entire "treat this like an actual rescue with a strange civilian" pitch. She managed to avoid the others, but one of them struck her. She was positive that one of her spots would have simply been removed if Jiren could have seen them clearly. She urged, "Go that way," indicating the location where Tenko ought to have been waiting. "I'll run in the opposite direction and distract them." She pointed out that accompanying her would put him in closer proximity to the bad guys before he could decide to be in Cooperative as part of their lesson. Mr. Staney ran in the designated direction, seemingly accepting that as a legitimate threat to a civilian. Jiren was positive his ice had hit, but apparently not enough to eliminate him. Unfortunately, he was able to see both of the targets. Alright, so it seems that one of their rivals had a peculiarity that allowed them to appear as someone else. Which one was the real one? Did it matter? That could be challenging. He sent 2 of his ice cubes to the one running to the left and 3 more to the one running to the right because it was advantageous for him to remove both anyhow according to the rules. Tenko noticed that Akaguro-sensei and Toga were behaving exactly as he had expected. Unfortunately, it seems that the obnoxious Eskimo child was more adept at controlling his quirk than Tenko had anticipated. His gambit would be defeated since both of them were being targeted and, as it appeared, were in actual danger. He had created a strategy with an easy counter by underestimating the enemy's capabilities. Besides, he was still crude in his control of his quirk. All of this really infuriated him, which is why he had that early thought. "Let's test your ability to maintain ice's functionality in hot water." Because of his years of intense physical training, he was able to jump with nearly superhuman speed to touch the sections of the water vane he had identified that were preventing the flow. As expected, it began to spray everywhere. Then, with the same speed, he went for the boiler, touching it just right so that its rapidly rusting exterior sprayed out superheated water into what was already beginning to flow into the small valley where Toga, Akaguro-sensei, and Sorimitsu were still running about. He hoped that Toga had specced into speed and reflex saves as much as she had claimed. A change in the environment was accomplished. He had attempted, and sometimes succeeded, in freezing room temperature water. To his own annoyance, he had not mastered the skill. He therefore knew that trying to freeze any of the heated water that was spraying into the area would be a waste of time, but perhaps he could keep the ice that was already frozen above it. This is because one of the Akaguro-sensei leapt onto an unusually high piece of rubble to avoid the hot water, right above his own position, and sent a scalpel flying to mark where the other could do the same, which revealed which one was the real one, and jiren didn't really cared all that much. He attempted to go for the upper bodies, away from the hot water, but the false teacher ducked, sending his own ice flying just too close to the soaked hot ground, and he was dejected when it melted in front of him. My quirk isn't working. What can I do? Well, I have no value. A small amount of blood was drawn when he slammed his fist into the roof above him. Just as Toga saw Sorimitsu barely making it onto another piece of debris, she heard jiren having his little mental breakdown. The water level wasn't very high. Following the first downpour, it began to rapidly drop, giving them access to routes that allowed them to hop around the small valley. They could all make it, all three of them, but now she was farther away from Staney than her rivals. She frantically reasoned that this might work to get them to pursue you while Tenko rescued him. In any case, that was the original plan. Oh no, this water is getting me all wet. Why won't a real hero come and save me? She exclaimed, mimicking the, in character, voice of Akaguro-sensei as best she could. Sorimitsu glanced at both Staney's, smiled, and pursued her rather than the real one. She was thrilled because that gave the real one time to get away, but as he drew closer, she began to question if she could actually challenge him to a straight fight. The question was real. Jiren forced himself to relax by breathing slowly, which gave him enough mental clarity to look out and see that Sorimitsu was closing in on one of the Akaguro-sensei while the other was fleeing. Jiren's earlier observation with the scalpels made him realize that he was pursuing the fake one. While it's okay to eliminate the heroes as well, he is the more crucial target. Jiren realized that in order to complete this exercise, he needed to gather himself. Invoking Destro's most motivational remarks about realizing one's own potential and discovering pride in one's own accomplishments, he departed from his small makeshift cave and leapt onto the closest wet debris protruding from the rapidly vanishing water line. He might still be helpful. He was still capable of fighting. Since she couldn't see Tenko, Toga became a little alarmed when she saw Jiren leaping out of the cave below her and heading for the next island, before she could get her syringes down and go after the real Staney while Sorimitsu went in her direction. There wasn't really a good way to dodge around the boy, and she wasn't sure she could defeat Sorimitsu in a straight fight. She also wasn't sure she could defeat him in time to prevent Jiren from taking out their civilian while she was preoccupied with him. She screamed to herself, think, until she recalled the Nomu and its resistance quirk. Is Staney's quirk available to me? She still didn't know what made that Nomu different from her previous attempts to use other quirks because she hadn't had a good chance to practice on other people since making the observation, but it would be great to know now. She felt something inside of her. She had always been drawn to blood because she thought it smelled and looked beautiful, but now she could smell it like never before. Did Staney see blood like this? Did she notice that Jiren had bled a little on the cave's roof right below her because of this? Taking the chance, she dipped her head below the outcropping she was standing on, licked it, and grabbed its edge. Toga was rewarded with the feeling that the blood she had just drawn had a familiar, manageable quality. If she told it to stop, she heard Jiren sag. Like any of Staney's victims, he was paralyzed. She hardly noticed Sorimitsu vying for her spots because she was so thrilled and excited. She smiled, twirled her syringe, and swung for a painful but non-fatal blow against the boy wearing the cloth mask, only to completely miss because she forgot she was dealing with Staney's body and not her own. She was so shocked that she allowed him to elbow one of her spots, and her stumbling around allowed him to get her syringe into his mouth and eat it before she could hurt him anymore. I lost. Himiko Toga is eliminated. When all of his spots were abruptly tapped, Sorimitsu smiled to himself, searching for something to eat and celebrating his victory in style. Tenko celebrated as the voice yelled, Sorimitsu Tabe is eliminated. Don't get distracted by one opponent when fighting a dual boss, Tenko said. Against the paralysis, Jiren fought. It was simply wrong the way it regulated his blood, preventing him from moving. There was a part of him that said he shouldn't be thinking that way about a quirk, but there was another part of him that told him it was all right to despise the fact that it was being against him. Then, though, it began to wane. This was a much weaker form of the quirk that he had encountered on the first day of school from Akaguro-sensei. As he began to move again, he saw the civilian, who was obviously the real one because Sorimitsu had removed Toga, squalling and attempting to stay dry while stuck, on his piece of debris. The day would still be theirs if Jiren could just land a blow while Tenko was preoccupied with celebrating his win. Perhaps he had some ice cubes there that hadn't melted yet. Though he was still unsteady and dizzy from Toga's mimicry of Akaguro-sensei's trick, he found one he hadn't thrown out earlier and succeeded in getting it to float, keeping it farther away from the water. Tenko paused his boasting to observe that Jiren was once more on the move. He reprimanded himself for not following the advice he had just given his defeated opponent, adding, "Don't get distracted by one opponent during an escort mission, either." He was sure he could have made it running over dry ground, so he rushed forward, but he was slowed down by hopping from piece of rubble to piece of rubble, which prevented him from reaching Jiren until Tenko hit one spot, then another, and then. The civilian is dead. The villains win. While Tenko stood with his fists clenched, resisting the urge to have a tantrum, and Jiren was pumping his fist in the air while attempting to stand, Yu and Toya consoled Sorimitsu, congratulating him on his technical victory and assuring him that getting eliminated was okay. Toga stood by herself, her eyes sad. "You were amazing," she was told. She noticed it was the Shigaraki boy when she looked up. "No, I wasn't, I got defeated over a simple mistake. You tricked both of your opponents, got them focusing on the wrong target, and took one down from across an entire field. Also, can you imitate others' quirks? That's just incredible. It's like all for one, but with being able to change your image as well." Izuku began enumerating the many theoretical applications for her newly acquired skill, and to be honest, it was pleasant. She quickly lost track of what he was actually saying, but it just made her realize how much she had needed this throughout her life to have someone, even someone who had initially obviously found her quirk creepy, come to value it so much. Who was this boy from Izuku? She pondered what it would be like to be him as she observed him muttering. If he really wanted to know how her peculiarity operated. Without giving it any thought, she blurted out, "Would you let me try it out on you?" When she realized what she had just said, she almost instantly went back to apologizing for making people uncomfortable, but Izuku nodded before she could say anything more. "I won't pretend that it doesn't weird me out a little, but you should learn, and I'd like to learn with you." Not even Staney, who was not at all repulsed by her peculiarity, volunteered to allow her to drink in this manner. Before Mr. Staney cut her off, she was so thrilled that she had nearly forgotten she had just lost a graded competition. "If you are done talking amongst yourselves, then I would like to congratulate both teams on showing strategic thinking and refusing to give up even when it looked like the odds were turned against you. However, while you didn't exploit the rules to quite the same extent that Izuku and Toya did, flooding the area that the civilian is running through and trusting them to be able to climb out of the way would be stupid in a real crisis." After staring at them both, he continued, "Also, it's important to remember that, in a hero situation, lives are on the line. Not just your own, not even just the civilians counting on you to save them, but that of your partners. Jiren and Tenko, both of you saw the potential in your teammates' quirks, and that's commendable, but you both sent them out there on their own and largely left them in danger. Don't get me wrong, a true hero doesn't fear risking his or her life, but you both should have done more to provide support throughout the fight, not just near the end. He smiled. "There is a lot to work on, but you all still did pretty well. I'm not disappointed." His smile broadened. "And now that I know where to focus on with your training, I know where putting you through absolute hell will help the most. We're going to have a great time over the next 4 years." That didn't seem comforting to any of them. Despite having predicted Lord Explosion Murder's future and witnessed his success in assembling the four, Night Eyes was still taken aback. He predicted that this Bakugo kid would fail his first real mission as a leader within their organization, but that he would learn a valuable lesson that would help them in the future. Unfortunately, his next actions wouldn't. The lesson he learned turned out to be incredibly ambiguous, unlike anything he had ever seen in his visions. Nedzu was adamant about trying out the other candidates that his brain and Night Eye's vision had spotted potential for, so he wasted his time with the obnoxious little brat, even though he was positive that Lemillion was the clear favorite for the position. "You succeeded. Well then, a bargain is a bargain. Our next operation, that we want you to oversee, is an attack on society's #1 symbol for the future of heroism. We want you to strike a blow against UA itself." He waited a little while for the boy to react to this disclosure. Naturally, Lord Explosion Murder filtered it through his brittle ego. "You want me to spend my time on a 2-bit school for so-called heroes that aren't even old enough to be real heroes? What kind of bullshit is this?" Night Eyes sighed and adjusted his glasses. You may have noticed that all of the people are about your age, right? All the right age to attend UA, had they been so inclined and lucky enough to get through its entrance exam. This is what we want from you. Show the world that the up-and-coming generation of villains is better than the up-and-coming generation of heroes, and more importantly show them that the heroes they rely on can't protect the most vulnerable. People really freak out about danger to children, it gets politics moving forward. Often in the direction we want it. Clearly still displeased, Lord Explosion Murder gritted his teeth before finally spitting out a, fine, just give me the details. ////. On the outside, Shota Todoroki appeared composed. The fire burning inside was barely visible. The others avoided him because they could still feel it. Excellent. He was only interested in backing his father's main rivals and, ideally, taking the lead in the future. He had no interest in any of these young bloods who would most likely be imprisoned within a year, not even Tartarus. Attempting to establish camaraderie, even the underground's loyal brotherhood, would only hinder his progress. He only gave him a fleeting glance before turning to face the wall, ignoring the threat, when one of them, a burly boy in an absurd yellow suit, came forward to challenge him as to who was the strongest of them. Taking a piece of cake out of his pocket and biting into it, the boy in the yellow suit exclaimed, "Hey, you got a problem." His muscles instantly grew larger. Unconcerned, Todoroki raised one hand and sprayed the persistent intruder with ice, enclosing him in the icy prison and providing him with a brief moment of solitude. Their leader informed them, "Hey, I don't want any fighting between my henchmen." Even though he could put up with the fact that this, Lord Explosion Murder, what a ridiculous name, was strong enough to take some sort of command and skilled with his quirk, Todoroki had no real respect for the loudmouthed blonde. This is my origin story, and I don't want to waste time keeping you losers in line, got it? So make sure you do everything I say so that some of my glory can rub off on you. The only one who appeared to be paying attention was the man who ate cake and was muscular, presumably hoping that their boss would rescue him from his frozen prison. At the moment, the pink girl with the horns was practicing her movements while the boy with the purple balls for hair was attempting to cop a feel on her. The others were either still working on whatever they had been working on before he entered, or they were rolling their eyes, including Todoroki, at least internally. With full awareness that no one was listening, Lord Explosion Murder threw a very large example of his namesake into the air. At least that made everyone look at him. Quote, "We're going to attack UA." Before anyone was able to respond, he continued, "The terrible trio are going to get us in. We're going to do as much damage to Class 1A as we can, and then they're going to get us out once their own mission is complete." Oh well, he'd show these geezers soon enough. He didn't bother to hide his resentment that those three had been given their own, far more important mission, and that his motley crew was obviously intended to serve as a distraction for it, even though no one had told him so. There was a part of him that felt he ought to devise a plan, but then he looked at his ragtag crew, and he hadn't bothered to learn any of their names, because why would he, and nothing about them suggested that he should, but he figured if they were going to follow him, he should know their peculiarities. "Hey, Pinky, this is the Alien Queen. What can you do, anyway?" "I create acid, I'm also pretty good at. How about you?" and never stopped sparkling. It continued in this manner for the next 5 minutes, until he discovered the scarred one. "It's Lumiere, monsieur, and I form a laser on my belly, but if I use it too long." "Burn face, what are you capable of?" He ignored him and muttered, "More than you. You bastard, what did you say? I'll murder you." The tips of Burnface's fingers turned to ice. "Very well, try." After a good 10 minutes of glaring at each other, Lord Explosion Murder snorted, saying, "I don't have time to waste on a henchman's ego. Let's get going." Aoyama became somewhat alarmed. "Now, monsieur, I haven't got everything ready. What have you been up to for the past hour?" Lord Explosion Murder retorted, "If you're not ready, then get killed in the field for all I care." He sincerely hoped that he would be pardoned later because he had no way of telling his handlers about this information. If Izuku claimed that Toga's peculiarity wasn't unsettling, he would be lying. In addition to the fact that it hurt to have her stab him, the thought of having his blood drawn was disgusting in and of itself. He had never been a big fan of hospitals, but objectively, it wasn't that bad because she had her needles to inject him with, and it wasn't really any more painful than what one would typically go through at a hospital with a syringe and IV. She had never made fun of or condemned him for his propensity to mutter, so he felt it was only fair to return the favor by treating her own morbid interests with the same deference. The fact that she felt the need to comment on his beautiful veins only made the situation more awkward. Toga ignored his discomfort, too preoccupied with the red prize she had just won, and he seethed through the sharp prick of the wide syringe stabbing into his arm, noting that it quickly returned to a dull and much more bearable pain as it stood there, and then seethed again as it actually hurt more on the way out and forced him to put pressure on a bit of gauze to prevent further bleeding. As she ingested his blood, Izuku pushed down his nausea, which wasn't as hard as he had imagined, and her body and face shifted and warped, almost like a liquid covering, before Izuku replaced her. Not at the sight of his own face, but at the formation of the liquid and its strange movement, all his nausea and fear vanished. How did that happen? Did she briefly transform into liquid? Could she sustain such a state? Had she ever tried? He found himself muttering again without realizing it as questions and possible combinations raced through his mind, blocking out any thoughts he might have had about how incorrect the entire idea was. Since only one of them was able to lose himself in thought the way Izuku just did, it was still possible to tell which one was which even if one had previously met them. Toga stifled a laugh. After his tolerance of her peculiarities, it wouldn't be appropriate to make fun of his. Instead, she felt her new body on an internal level that everyone went through, but she still wasn't sure how to explain to others. Not in a sexual sense, although, as a hormonal adolescent, such thoughts did cross her mind. They weren't her main focus, but simply allowing herself to experience what it was like to be, feel, and look like Izuku. She searched for indications of his quirk but found none, which was not surprising since she wasn't always able to mimic quirks. She wasn't sure what made her able to do so, and he wasn't really familiar with his own quirk. She knew what it was like to not have his particular quirk, so perhaps she could find out what was different between them and bring it up, possibly helping him when it came time to use it for himself. However, she still felt nothing. Izuku himself couldn't bring up the power inside, so how would she? She shrugged and asked Izuku if he wanted to do any tests while they were out. He nodded, waking from his daze. Yeah, I was curious about the impact on your physical form. Do you currently possess your strength or mine? When they compared her ability to move and apply strength in her shifted form versus her normal form, she appeared to be at about the same level as Izuku, who was slightly stronger than her but much faster and more agile. The rest of the afternoon was spent in this manner. Izuku's comment regarding her momentary liquid state was mainly ineffective because she was unable to hold on to it or do anything other than wait for it to change, which led her to return to Toga, but she was happy that she had tried because she didn't think she would have considered that. Until they took a break and began talking about their other interests, they spent the afternoon together, Izuku constantly praising her peculiarity and she praising his perspective on the world. Which, as it happened, was rather depressing. I simply pursued hobbies that I believed would help me fit into that mold rather than because I truly enjoyed them because I was constantly so preoccupied with being normal and this ideal little girl. I can play the piano and knit, for example, but I don't think I want to do either of those things anymore. It just makes me think about why I started doing it, which annoys me even if I might have been interested. Being the son of the #1 hero and not knowing if I could be a hero myself, even though I really wanted to, turned into an obsession, Izuku said, uneasily scratching the back of his neck. His eyes lowered. I guess I never really allowed myself time for anything else, because I study quirks and heroes, and it probably would have affected anything else I touched. Besides, I was so worthless in general. Stop saying that, instructed Toga. What? Stop claiming you are unworthy. You have already made good use of your brilliant mind. Since UA only accepts the best, you deserve to be there. To be completely honest, when I saw the entrance results, I assumed that you were admitted solely because of your father. Recognize that you are among the best. You're not worthless, and I'm not a freak. Moving forward, we will both accept this. Izuku responded clumsily. Well, that has nothing to do with that, but you're not a freak. Nope, she said, instantly cutting off his attempt at reasoning. My freakiness and your worthlessness exist together, because I say so. So every time you look down on yourself, you're calling me a freak, and I refuse to accept that. He threw up his arms without even trying to deny such a ridiculous leap. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to call you anything bad. Toga let out a sigh. You may not be worthless, but you are kind of hopeless. For once, Inko Shigaraki's husband wasn't working late today, and she wasn't going to pass up the chance to enjoy a nice family meal. He found their son for her using one of his many oddities, and she ended up finding her little baby, with a girl, In a trash-filled park, someone really needs to clean it up. It's a pretty one, too. She embraced the first and called out the opposing wolves of fear of becoming a grandmother too soon and excitement at seeing her baby boy all grown up. Izu, are you going to introduce your girlfriend to me? Both of their blushes were the cutest things. Mom, she's not. I mean, you have it wrong. No, I don't like her. I mean I like her, but, we're just friends. He was trying to shout. Toga bowed respectfully, regaining her poise much faster. Hello, Mrs. Shigaraki, I'm Himiko Toga, and your son and I were training together. I want to say that you have raised a fine young man, and that there's no need to worry, as he makes sure the entire ordeal is completely safe. A sly grin spread across her face. He is always sure to use protection. When she made her declaration, Izuku passed out. The fact that Toga was dining at a friend's house was totally acceptable to her parents. Indeed, they appeared completely thrilled that she had a friend. They had total faith in the Shigaraki family's ability to care for their daughter, but there was no desire to meet the friend in question. Toga suspected that, deep down, they wondered what kind of person would actually want to be friends with her, and were frightened by the prospect, but she kept that to herself. She pondered whether they brought up the fact that that was all for one's name but concluded it didn't matter. If they cared, they could work it out later. Thus, Himiko Toga had one of her first dinners with a friend while seated around a table with the 3 Shigaraki family members. If they could have been persuaded that the two were just friends, it might have been a little less awkward. The obvious double meanings in all of Mrs. Shigaraki's questions tempered even the excitement of meeting someone like All for One himself.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, bye bye.